Hey guys, tonight we're slipping our fingers into the worn leather pouches that dangle from medieval women's belts, discovering the tiny treasures and practical secrets they carried everywhere they went. You stand in a bustling market square in 14th century London, and your eyes drift to the woman haggling over cabbage hanging at her hip. Just below her kirtle's embroidered edge swings a small pouch no bigger than your fist. Inside that pouch lies her entire portable world keys that unlock her authority, coins that grant her independence, needles that repair her dignity, and perhaps a love token she'll never confess to owning. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, like why medieval paintings show women clutching these little bags with such fierce protectiveness, or why sumptuary laws try to regulate even the fabric of a purse. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, or maybe share what you imagine you'd carry in your own medieval pouch if you could step back in time. Your support keeps these midnight journeys alive, and every comment reminds me that history's whispers still matter in our modern world. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You reach down and touch the pouch hanging from your own woven girdle, feeling the supple leather warm against your palm. This isn't just a bag, it's an extension of your body, as essential as the shoes on your feet or the veil pinned to your hair. Medieval women didn't have pockets sewn into their clothing. That innovation wouldn't arrive until centuries later, when tailors began stitching hidden pouches into men's breeches and women's petticoats. Instead, you rely on this suspended pouch, attached to your belt by leather thongs or delicate chains, swaying with every step you take through the muddy streets. The church watches these pouches with suspicion and fascination in equal measure. Priests thunder from pulpit platforms about vanity and excess, warning that a woman's purse can become a vessel of sin if she uses it to carry rouge for her cheeks or love letters from unsuitable men. You've heard the sermons Father Benedict spent an entire Sunday ranting about how expensive purses demonstrate pride, one of the 7 deadly sins, and how women who jingle their coin-filled bags in public are inviting theft, assault, and divine punishment. Yet even the prioress at the local convent carries a leather pouch embroidered with golden thread, so you suspect the rules bend depending on who's doing the carrying. The way you wear your pouch tells a story that everyone around you can read like a manuscript. Noble women drape silk purses heavy with embroidery, and sometimes even jewelled clasps, letting them dangle conspicuously at hip level where light catches the metalwork. Merchant wives opt for sturdy leather stamped with geometric patterns, practical but decorated enough to signal their husband's success in the wool trade or spice commerce. Peasant women tie rough linen pouches with simple drawstrings, functional bags that hold a copper coin or two and maybe a crust of bread for the walk home from the fields. You fall somewhere in the middle. Your pouch is good leather, not the finest, but well made by the cobbler who stitched your winter boots. It marks you as comfortable, neither struggling nor extravagant, exactly where you want strangers to place you in the medieval social ladder. Historians still argue whether women's pouches were purely utilitarian or served as medieval fashion statements equivalent to modern designer handbags. Some scholars point to illuminated manuscripts showing elaborately decorated purses that clearly prioritized beauty over function, arguing that these accessories communicated status, taste, and even marital availability. Other researchers counter that even decorated pouches held essential items, and that beauty didn't negate utility in medieval thinking. A woman could carry her house keys in a gorgeous embroidered bag without contradiction. The debate continues in academic journals, but you living this moment don't separate the categories so cleanly. Your pouch is both tool and ornament, just as your best linen chemise is both undergarment and source of secret pride. The mechanics of attaching your pouch require more thought than you'd imagine. Your girdle, the woven belt cinching your gown at the waist, becomes the anchor point for everything you need to carry. Some women loop their pouches directly onto the belt with leather thongs that can be untied quickly when needed. Others prefer small metal hooks that let the bag swing freely but stay secure even when you're running to catch a misbehaving goat or bending to scrub the hearthstones. The wealthiest women commission chains of linked silver or even gold, attaching their purses with the same materials jewelers use for necklaces and bracelets. You've chosen a middle path, 2 sturdy leather straps with bone toggles that click into loops sewn onto your pouch's upper edge, secure enough that pickpockets can't simply yank the bag away, but quick enough to remove when you need to count your coins in private. Walking through the marketplace, you notice how women unconsciously guard their pouches with subtle body language. A baker's wife shifts her bag to her front when the crowd presses close, one hand resting protectively on the worn leather. A silk merchant's daughter lets her embroidered purse swing freely in the open square where her father's guards stand watch, but clutches it tight when she ventures into the narrow alley leading to the goldsmith's stall. You've developed the same instincts. Your hand drifts to your pouch whenever strangers jostle past, and you've learned to sleep with the bag tucked under your pillow when staying at unfamiliar inns along the pilgrimage routes. The vulnerability of carrying everything important in one small bag creates constant anxiety. Unlike modern women who can lock valuables in safes or bank vaults, you must choose each morning what precious items to risk carrying versus what to hide in your wooden chest at home. The decision weighs on you. Take your spare coins and risk losing them to thieves, or leave them hidden and find yourself short when the fishmonger offers a good price on herring. Carry your dead mother's silver thimble as a comfort, or secure it in the false bottom of your clothing trunk. Every medieval woman makes these calculations daily, and every medieval woman knows someone who lost everything when her pouch was cut from her belt by a sharp knife in a crowded tavern. Yet the pouch also grants freedom that medieval women cherish fiercely. With your essentials hanging at your hip, you can leave the house without asking permission or assistance. You can walk to market, conduct business, visit the church, or call on a sick neighbour without depending on servants or family members to carry things for you. This independence might seem trivial to modernise, but in a world where women's movements are constantly monitored and controlled, your little leather pouch becomes a passport to autonomy. You carry your own money, your own keys, your own tools. You carry proof that you exist as more than decoration or property. The social rules governing pouches create a peculiar dance at formal occasions. At wedding feasts, women display their finest purses but pretend not to notice each other, staring and comparing. In church, you're supposed to keep your pouch hidden beneath your cloak, though every woman peeks to see what the merchant's wife commissioned for Easter. At funerals, plain dark pouches signal proper mourning, and wearing embroidered silk would scandalise the gossips for months. You've learned these unwritten codes through observation and occasional harsh correction, like the time you wore your decorated pouch to a funeral and your aunt pulled you aside with a whispered scolding that still burns your cheeks when you remember. The pouch hanging at your hip right now contains items we'll explore in the sections ahead, but already you can feel their weight and shape the hard angles of iron keys, the soft lumpiness of an herb bundle, the cool smoothness of a few coins. Each object tells part of your story, reveals fragments of your daily reality, whispers secrets about medieval womanhood that no chronicle or church record bothers to preserve. As you adjust the leather straps and continue through the market square, you're carrying more than practical necessities. You're carrying evidence that medieval women claimed space, wielded power, and insisted on small dignities in a world determined to deny them agency. Do you remember that feeling of touching the warm leather for the first time? Hold on to it, because now we're going to open that pouch and discover exactly what medieval women considered essential enough to carry everywhere. Beginning with the most powerful objects of all, the keys that unlocked not just doors, but social authority itself. You slip your fingers past the leather flap of your pouch and immediately encounter cold iron 3 keys of different sizes. They're metal chilled even on this mild afternoon. The largest key weighs heavy in your palm, its shaft as thick as your thumb and nearly as long, with elaborate teeth that match the mechanism in your household storeroom door. This key doesn't just unlock a room, it unlocks your identity as the woman who controls the bread, the salted meat, the precious stores of honey and imported spices that represent your family's wealth and survival through the coming winter. Medieval marriage ceremonies sometimes include a ritual where the groom's mother passes a ring of keys to the new bride, a symbolic transfer of domestic authority that every witness understands. You received your keys on a cold November morning 3 years ago, and you remember how your mother-in-law's arthritic fingers trembled as she placed the iron circle in your hands. Her eyes met yours with an expression you couldn't quite read, relief mixed with territorial reluctance. Perhaps, or recognition that age demands succession whether we're ready or not. Those keys transformed you from girl living in her father's house to the woman responsible for ensuring no one starved when the harvest failed or the supply wagons couldn't get through the snow-blocked roads. The storeroom key opens more than a door. It opens a world of medieval anxiety about scarcity and theft. Behind that locked door sit barrels of grain that must last until next harvest, wheels of cheese aging on wooden shelves, smoked hams hanging from ceiling hooks, and clay jars filled with a lard you'll need for cooking through winter's darkest months. If rats get in, your family faces hunger. If servants steal portions to sell at market, the household accounts won't balance and suspicion will poison every interaction. If you miscalculate and run short in February, you'll be begging neighbours for loans at humiliating interest rates. The key in your pouch carries the weight of all these fears, and you've developed the habit of touching it throughout the day like a rosary bead, reassuring yourself it hasn't vanished. Your second key, smaller and more delicate, unlocks the wooden chest where you keep the household linens, the good linen tablecloths for when the master's business partners dine with you, the embroidered napkins that were part of your dowry, the sheets you've been saving for your daughter's wedding trousseau. Though she's only 7 years old, linen represents significant wealth in the medieval economy. A single fine tablecloth might cost as much as a farmer earns in a month. Keeping these textiles locked away protects them from theft, certainly, but also from the well-meaning servants who might use the good napkins to wrap their lunch or dry their hands after washing dishes. You've caught the scullery maid eyeing those linens with longing, and you don't entirely blame her. She sleeps on straw and wipes her hands on her skirt, while your chest holds enough soft fabric to make her weep with envy. The third key on your ring is tiny, no longer than your smallest finger, and it opens the casket where you hide things even your husband doesn't know about. Inside that little carved box rest the silver coins your grandmother left you, your emergency fund, the money that's legally yours rather than your husband's property, the nest egg that could save you if widowhood or disaster strikes. Also in that box a letter from your sister, a strand of your first baby's hair tied with a silk thread, and a brass ring a young man gave you before your father arranged your marriage to someone wealthier. These aren't shameful secrets exactly. but they're private enough that you'd rather keep them locked away from curious eyes and gossiping tongues. Historians still argue whether medieval women's control of household keys represented genuine power or merely the illusion of authority within a system designed to subordinate them. Some scholars emphasize that key holding gave women real decision-making capability over daily consumption, resource allocation, and household management power that shouldn't be dismissed just because it operated in domestic rather than public spheres. Other researchers counter that this power was merely delegated authority that husbands or fathers could revoke at will, and that focusing on keys and pantries distracts from women's systematic exclusion from legal, political and economic power. The truth probably shifts depending on which household you're examining and which woman holds the keys. But you living this reality know that your keys matter enormously, even if philosophers and lawmakers ignore you. The sound of keys jangling at your hip announces your approach like a herald's trumpet. When you walk through the kitchen, servants straighten their postures and look busy because the woman with the keys has arrived. When you cross the courtyard to the storeroom, the stable boy calls out a respectful greeting because the key holder deserves acknowledgement. This acoustic signature of authority matters in a world where most women move through spaces silently, deferentially, trying not to draw attention. Your keys give you permission to make noise, to take up sonic space, to let metal clink against metal as a reminder that you control access to the resources everyone depends on. Losing your keys would be catastrophic on multiple levels. Practically, you'd have to summon the locksmith, an expense and an embarrassment, especially if you had to confess the loss to your husband. Socially, you'd face whispered speculation about your competence and reliability. After all, if you can't keep track of 3 keys, can you be trusted with household management symbolically? Walking around without keys would strip you of visible authority, reducing you to just another woman in the crowd rather than the keeper of stores and guardian of resources. You've heard stories of women who lost their keys and spent weeks searching frantically before finally confessing. And you've heard darker stories of women who lost their positions in the household hierarchy when keys disappeared and suspicion suggested they'd sold them to thieves. The metal of your keys has absorbed the warmth of your body by mid-afternoon. Losing that morning chill and feeling almost alive against your fingertips, you've worn grooves into the largest key's shaft from years of gripping it the same way each time you unlock the storeroom. And there's a small nick in the middle key where you once dropped it on the stone floor and chipped the iron. These imperfections make the keys unmistakably yours, as personal as the calluses on your hands or the scar on your wrist from the time you reached into the oven too hastily. Some women commission decorative key rings to display their keys more beautifully. You've seen a goldsmith's wife with keys hanging from a chain of linked silver roses, and a noblewoman visiting from France whose keys dangled from a girdle hook shaped like a golden lion. Your own setup is simpler, a plain iron ring threaded through the key's loops, attached to your pouch with a short leather thong, functional rather than fancy, but secure and reliable, which matters more than beauty when you're responsible for feeding 12 people every day. The keys also serve as a strange form of protection in dangerous situations. You've heard that women travelling alone sometimes clutch their largest key like a weapon, the heavy iron shaft and sharp teeth capable of gouging an attacker's face or hand if necessary. You've never had to test this defensive strategy yourself, but you've definitely gripped your storeroom key tighter when walking past groups of drunk men outside taverns, and you've definitely felt reassured by the solid weight of iron in your fist. Whether keys actually work as weapons or just provide psychological comfort remains unclear. But in a world where women have few means of self-defense, even the illusion of protection matters. Your mother-in-law, who passed the keys to you 3 years ago, now lives in a small room at the back of the house and carries no keys at all. You visit her sometimes and see how her hands move restlessly, as if searching for iron that's no longer there. She tells you stories about the years she held the keys the winter when snow blocked the roads for 2 months, and she rationed the grain so precisely that the household didn't run short until the very last day before the thaw. The harvest festival when she fed 40 guests on a budget meant for 20. The time she caught a dishonest servant with stolen cheese and personally marched him to the magistrate. These stories are her identity now, memories of when keys granted her purpose and authority. You listen carefully because someday you'll be the old woman in the back room, and your own daughter or daughter-in-law will carry these keys, and you'll have nothing but stories to prove you once mattered. Do you remember the weight of that iron in your palm? The keys are just the beginning. Next we'll explore what else jingles and clinks in your pouch. The coins that represent freedom and danger in equal measure. You shift the keys aside and your fingers find the small linen purse nested within your larger leather pouch. A purse within a purse, this inner bag holding your coins separate from everything else, so their edges don't scratch your other possessions and their metallic smell doesn't transfer to your herb bundles. You loosen the drawstring and pour the contents into your palm, 4 silver pennies. 2 half-pennies clipped so small they're barely recognisable, and 1 foreign coin you accepted last week from a Flemish merchant who swore it was worth 3 English pennies, though you suspect he lied. Medieval currency creates constant headaches that modern people with standardised money can barely imagine. The silver penny in your hand was minted in London during King Edward's reign, and it's worth exactly 1 penny, except it's not, because someone has shaved microscopic amounts of silver from its edges, a practice so common that you barely notice anymore. The next penny came from a provincial mint and theoretically holds the same value, but merchants in the capital sometimes refuse provincial coins or demand 2 of them to equal 1 London penny. The Flemish coin gleams with unfamiliar markings, and you'll probably have to visit the money changer to convert it, paying him a fee that will devour half its value. Welcome to medieval economics, where every transaction requires negotiation and trust is a luxury nobody can afford. Women's relationship with money operates under legal restrictions that would infuriate modern feminists, but that you've learned to navigate with cunning and compromise. Technically, in many regions, married women can't own property independently. Everything belongs to either your father or your husband, depending on your marital status. Practically, everyone understands that women need coins to run households, buy food at market, pay servants, and handle the 1,000 small transactions that keep daily life functioning. So a strange parallel economy emerges where you borrow money from your husband's purse, conduct business in his name, and return the change. But everyone pretends you're just an extension of his will rather than an economic actor making your own decisions. The 4 silver pennies currently warming in your palm represent your grocery budget for the next 3 days. You've already mentally allocated them 1 penny for the fishmonger if he has fresh pike, half a penny for the vegetable seller whose carrots looked good yesterday, another half-penny for the egg woman, and the remaining penny held in reserve for unexpected opportunities or emergencies. This mental accounting happens automatically now, a constant background calculation that never stops running in your head. You know the price of everything sold within a mile of your house. You know which vendors give generous measures and which ones short you, and you know exactly how much financial flexibility exists between adequate meals and hunger. The 2 clipped half-pennies embarrass you slightly because their diminished size advertises that someone desperate for silver shaved them down, possibly multiple someones over the years since they were minted. Coin clipping is technically a crime punishable by death. You've heard stories of clippers hanged in London. Their bodies displayed as warnings, yet everyone does it to some degree. And everyone accepts clipped coins because refusing them would bring commerce to a standstill. You just try not to be the person left holding the most obviously mutilated coins when the music stops and authorities decide to crack down on currency degradation. Historians still argue whether medieval women had more or less economic autonomy than legal documents suggest. Some scholars point to court records showing women buying property, running businesses, and engaging in commerce despite laws that theoretically prohibited such independence, suggesting that practice diverged significantly from theory. Other researchers emphasize that these exceptions prove the rule the very fact that we notice. Women conducting business indicates how unusual it was, and most women remained economically dependent on male relatives throughout their lives. You don't have the luxury of this academic debate. You just know that the coins in your hand give you power to make choices, even if those choices operate within narrow boundaries. The Flemish coin catches afternoon light filtering through your fingers. Its foreign design both beautiful and suspect. The merchant who gave it to you spoke broken English and seemed trustworthy. But you've learned that seeming trustworthy is a skill merchants cultivate specifically to exploit trusting women. You'll take this coin to Aaron the money changer tomorrow, and he'll examine it with his expert eyes. Perhaps bite it to test the metal's softness, definitely weigh it on his delicate scales, and eventually pronounce judgment on its value. If you're lucky, it's worth 3 pennies as promised. If you're unlucky, it's base metal with silver plating and you've been cheated. If you're extremely unlucky, it's counterfeit, and possessing it could bring you under suspicion of criminal activity. The act of counting your money in public marks you as either brave or foolish depending on who's watching. Wealthy women can afford to display coins carelessly because everyone knows they have guards or family members ready to avenge any theft. Poor women hide their pennies desperately because losing even 1 coin could mean a child goes hungry. You occupy the dangerous middle ground where you have enough to attract thieves but not enough to protect yourself adequately. So you've learned the art of counting by touch inside your pouch, identifying coins by feel without ever exposing them to watching eyes, the smooth edges of newer pennies versus the rough texture of clipped ones, the distinctive size of half pennies, the slightly different weight of the Flemish coin. Some women develop elaborate hiding strategies for emergency money. Your neighbour sews coins into the hem of her best gown, accepting the risk of losing the dress rather than face destitution with no reserves. A widow you know keeps a penny buried in her garden under the rosemary bush, though she worries constantly that rain will rust it or someone will accidentally dig it up. The baker's wife hides coins in a false bottom of her flour barrel, betting that thieves won't search through dusty grain. You've chosen a different approach. Most of your money stays in that lock casket we discussed earlier, but you will always carry a few coins in your pouch, because opportunities and emergencies don't wait for you to run home and unlock boxes. The sound of coins jingling in your pouch creates a musical announcement of your movements that sometimes delights you and sometimes terrifies you. On safe days in familiar neighbourhoods, you enjoy the cheerful clink of silver that marks you as solvent and respectable. On risky days in questionable districts, you stuff fabric around your coin purse to muffle the noise, wrap the inner bag in extra linen, press the pouch tight against your body to silence the telltale jingle. You've watched pickpockets working the crowd at market days, and you've noticed how their eyes track women whose pouches make metallic sounds. Jingling coins are an advertisement that might as well read, "Rob me here." Currency shortages plague medieval England periodically, and you've lived through 2 serious episodes when silver became scarce and people resorted to desperate improvisation. During the worst shortage, you remember accepting promises instead of coins the butcher gave you meat, on account. You gave the laundress clothing on trust. And everyone maintained elaborate mental ledgers of who owed what to whom. The system worked after a fashion, but it also created bitter disputes when memories diverged about exact amounts owed. You much prefer having actual silver in your hand, solid and undeniable, even if the coins are clipped and foreign and questionable. The relationship between coins and sin preoccupies preachers with exhausting frequency. You've heard sermons condemning usury, hoarding, excessive spending, insufficient charity, and basically every possible thing a person might do with money except immediately giving it to the church. Father Benedict particularly loves ranting about women who spend coins on vanity ribbons, cosmetics, decorated pouches rather than investing in their souls through donations and masses for the dead. You listen politely, and then buy the ribbons anyway, because medieval life is hard enough without denying yourself small pleasures, and you suspect God has bigger concerns than whether your hair is bound with plain wool or silk. Your grandmother taught you to always keep one coin separate from the rest, a penny you never spend no matter how desperate circumstances become. This emergency penny serves multiple purposes. It's funeral money in case you die suddenly and need someone to pay for your burial. It's bribe money if you're arrested unjustly and need to persuade a guard. It's escape money if everything collapses and you need to run. You keep this special penny in a tiny pocket you stitched inside your chemise, worn against your skin where no thief can reach without you noticing. The penny has lived there so long that it's absorbed your body heat and developed a permanent curve matching the shape of your ribs. The coins grow heavy in your palm as you stand in the market, mentally calculating whether you can afford the good cheese or should settle for the cheaper option. This moment of financial decision-making happens dozens of times each week, and each choice ripples outward, affecting meals, health, social standing, future possibilities. You close your fingers around the silver, feeling its coolness and weight, its promise and limitation. And you make your choice today. You'll splurge on the good cheese because your husband's employer is visiting for supper and impressions matter. But tomorrow you'll economize with barley instead of wheat bread to balance the accounts. Do you remember the weight of those coins, the anxiety and power they represent simultaneously? Tuck them back into their inner purse. We're moving on to softer items now, the needles and thread that let you repair the world when it frays around the edges. You push the coin purse aside and feel for something much smaller, something that could pierce your fingertip if you're careless, the bone needle case tucked into a corner of your pouch. You pull out the slim cylinder, no thicker than a goose quill and barely longer than your thumb, carved from a sheep's leg bone and polished smooth by years of handling. The case unscrews in the middle with a satisfying twist, revealing the precious cargo inside 3 needles of graduated sizes, each one representing hours of skilled labour by a needlemaker whose workshop you've never seen but whose craftsmanship you trust with your life. The largest needle is thick enough to pierce leather or heavy wool, its eye big enough to accommodate waxed linen thread, strong enough to repair a boot sole or reattach a cloak's detached hood. You've used this needle in emergencies, the time your husband tore his work tunic on a protruding nail and needed it mended before meeting with a guild master, the morning your daughter's shoe came apart on the way to church, and you crouched in the street stitching it back together while she stood on one foot complaining about the cold. This needle doesn't do delicate work, but it does reliable work. The kind that holds under stress and weather and the normal violence of medieval existence. The middle needle handles most of your daily repairs, the hems that drag through mud and need shortening, the seams that split when you bend or reach, the tears that happen when fabric catches on rough wood or sharp stone. This needle has stitched thousands of repairs into your family's clothing, creating an invisible history of minor catastrophes and quick fixes. Medieval people can't simply throw away damaged clothing and buy replacements. Fabric costs too much and waste is unthinkable, so you mend and mend and mend again, reinforcing weak spots before they tear, patching holes with fabric cut from garments too far gone to save, extending the life of every textile item until it literally falls apart in your hands. The smallest needle is your pride, and your frustration in equal measure, fine enough to do delicate embroidery but so tiny that threading it requires good light and steady hands. You've been working on an altar cloth for the church using this needle, adding silver thread in patterns that catch candlelight during Mass. The work proceeds slowly because you can only manage an hour or two before your eyes start to ache. But when finished, it will be beautiful enough to earn prayers for your soul and envious glances from other women whose embroidery skills don't match yours. This needle represents the difference between mere function and artistry, between clothing that covers your body and clothing that announces your refinement. Wrapped around all three needles inside the bone case, you find your thread supply, short lengths of linen thread in natural cream and dyed black, woolen thread in brown and blue, and one precious strand of silk thread you've been hoarding for a special project. Medieval thread doesn't come in the rainbow of colours available to modern sewers. You work with what natural dyes can produce and what your budget can afford. The black thread came from walnuts boiled until the water turned dark as midnight, the blue from woad that cost you a silver penny, the brown from madder root you gathered yourself during last autumn's herb collecting expedition. Historians still argue whether needlework represented oppression or opportunity for medieval women. Some scholars emphasize that textile work was unpaid domestic labor that kept women trapped in households, their creative energy channeled into maintaining other people's clothing rather than pursuing independence. Other researchers counter that needlework gave women valuable skills, created products they could sell for income, and provided one of the few acceptable outlets for female artistic expression and social gathering. You sitting here with a needle in hand don't care much about the academic debate. You just know that stitching brings both tedium and satisfaction, and that life without the ability to repair things would be impossible. The bone needle case itself tells a story about craft and value. Someone, probably a specialised bone worker in a city workshop, selected this particular sheep bone for its straightness and density, boiled it to remove all flesh and marrow, cut it to length with a fine saw, drilled out the hollow centre to create storage space, carved threads at both ends so the cap would screw on securely, and polished the whole thing until it gleamed like ivory. This object that you casually shove into your pouch represents hours of skilled labour, and you paid 2 pennies for it 3 years ago at a fair where craftsmen from across England displayed their wares. The case has developed a warm patina from contact with your hands and the oils in your pouch, and there's a tiny crack near the top that you keep meaning to repair with glue but haven't gotten around to yet. Threading a needle by candlelight after supper has become a meditation for you, a moment of focus that blocks out the day's chaos. You lick the thread end to stiffen it, pinch it flat between your fingers, squint at the needle's eye in the flickering light, and guide the thread through with a patience born of thousands of repetitions. Sometimes it goes through on the first attempt and you feel absurdly triumphant. Sometimes you miss a dozen times and want to throw the needle across the room in frustration. Modern people with their pre-threaded needles and bright electric lights have no idea how much of medieval women's attention went to this single preparatory act before any actual sewing could begin. Your pouch also contains a small pair of scissors, or rather, the medieval equivalent, which is really a folding knife with 2 blades that meet like shears when you squeeze the handle. These aren't the precise cutting instruments modern sewers take for granted. They're more like aggressive pinchers that crush thread fibres until they separate. You've learned to work with their limitations, cutting thread at an angle to create a point for threading, sawing through tougher materials rather than expecting clean snips. The scissors fold flat to protect their cutting edges and your fingers, and they are attached to your pouch with a short chain so you don't lose them in the chaos of market day or the darkness of your travelling bag. A tiny ball of beeswax completes your sewing kit, no bigger than a pea but invaluable for strengthening thread before you use it for heavy-duty repairs. You run the thread through the wax, warming it with your fingers until the wax melts slightly and penetrates the linen fibres, creating a thread that's stiffer, stronger, and more resistant to fraying. This trick turns ordinary thread into something that can handle the stress of reattaching a leather strap or reinforcing a buttonhole that's starting to tear. The beeswax came from your own kitchen where you rendered it from honeycomb last autumn, and it smells faintly sweet when you warm it between your palms. The social dynamics of needlework create complex hierarchies among women. At sewing circles, which happen after church on Sundays when women gather to work on communal projects, you've noticed how skill with a needle determines who sits where and whose opinions matter. The woman who can execute perfect satin stitch gets deference and admiration, while the woman whose seams are crooked receives condescending advice disguised as helpfulness. You fall somewhere in the middle of this hierarchy, competent but not exceptional, capable of producing neat work but not the breathtaking artistry that wins commissions from noble households. This middle position suits you fine. You have no desire to be the best needlewoman in the parish and bear the pressure of those expectations. Children learn needlework young in your world, and you remember your own mother forcing your 5-year-old fingers to grasp a needle that seemed enormous at the time. You cried from frustration and pricked fingers. You produced crooked seams that your mother made you pick out and redo. You swore you'd never subject your own daughter to this torture. Yet here you are, teaching your 7-year-old the same skills in the same patient, impatient tone your mother used, watching her struggle with the same difficulties you struggled with, knowing that this knowledge will serve her entire life, even as she resents acquiring it. The needles in your pouch represent generational transfer of essential skills, the unglamorous education that keeps medieval society clothed and functional. Emergency repairs happen in the strangest places. You've crouched in church vestibules stitching torn hems before entering for Mass, perched on market stall benches reattaching buttons that popped off during enthusiastic haggling, sat in ditches beside muddy roads fixing cloak clasps that broke during travel. Your needlecase makes all these moments of minor crisis manageable. You're never helpless in the face of textile failure, never dependent on finding a professional tailor, never forced to appear in public with visible damage to your clothing. This self-sufficiency matters enormously in a world where appearance directly affects how people treat you and what opportunities come your way. The needles have absorbed something of your personality through years of use. You always insert them into fabric at the same angle, creating a distinctive stitch pattern that you could identify blindfolded. You always knot your thread with 2 twists rather than 1, because your mother taught you that method and you've never questioned it. You always start repairs from the inside of the garment so the knot doesn't show, even when you're exhausted and tempted to take shortcuts. These tiny habits have become automatic, muscle memory encoded into your fingers, and you could probably sew competently even if someone blindfolded you and spun you in circles. Do you remember the satisfaction of pulling a needle through resistant fabric? The tiny pop as it breaks through to the other side. Those needles will stay safe in their bone case. We're moving now to softer contents. The herbs and flowers that promise to cure what ails you or at least make you smell better in the attempting. You press your fingers deeper into the pouch and encounter soft fabric. a small bundle wrapped in linen and tied with thread that started to fray from constant handling. You lift it to your nose before even opening it and breathe in the scent lavender and something sharper, perhaps rue or wormwood, herbs that promise protection from both disease and demons depending on which authority you ask. The bundle fits in your palm like a prayer, lightweight but potent with medieval hope that nature's pharmacy can ward off the 1,000 invisible dangers lurking in bad air, contaminated water, and the envious glances of neighbours who might wish you harm. You untie the thread carefully, not wanting to waste even this small length of fibre, and unfold the linen to reveal your portable apothecary. 3 small sachets nestle inside, each containing different dried herbs harvested at specific times for specific purposes. The first sachet holds lavender flowers you picked yourself last summer on the feast day of St. John, when herbs supposedly achieve their maximum potency and the dew on their leaves can cure ailments both physical and spiritual. You strip the purple flowers from their stems in the early morning, laid them on a wooden board in your attic where air circulates but rain can't reach, and turned them daily until they dried to a whisper of their former selves. Medieval people believe smell has power that extends far beyond simple pleasure or disgust. The prevailing medical theory, which you've absorbed through sermons, gossip, and the occasional conversation with the apothecary, holds that disease travels through foul odours, that pestilence and plague ride on stinking air, that you can protect yourself from infection by breathing sweet scents that purify your lungs and blood. So you carry lavender not just because it smells pleasant, though it does, but because you genuinely believe it creates an invisible shield between your body and the corrupted air that causes fever, flux, and the dreaded sweating sickness that killed 3 people in your street last winter. The second sachet contains rue, a bitter herb with a reputation for preventing plague and inducing abortion. In equal measure, medieval medicine makes no clear distinction between protective herbs and dangerous ones, often treating the same plant as both remedy and poison depending on dosage and intent. You harvested this rue from the patch growing behind your house, wearing gloves because fresh rue can blister skin if you're sensitive, cutting it during a waning moon because your grandmother insisted lunar phases affect herbal potency. The dried rue smells acrid and medicinal, nothing like lavender's sweetness, and you wouldn't want to breathe it constantly. But tucked in your pouch where its scent mingles with other odours, it supposedly protects against plague, repels insects, and guards against witchcraft. The third sachet holds a mixture you're less willing to discuss publicly: pennyroyal and tansy. Herbs with reputations for bringing on delayed monthly courses and solving the problems that arise when those courses fail to appear on schedule. You've never used these herbs for their more controversial purpose. Or at least, that's what you'd tell anyone who asked. But you know women who have, and you've heard the whispered instructions for how to brew the tea strong enough to work, but not so strong it makes you violently ill. The church condemns such practices as murder. The law defines them as felony. But medieval women facing unwanted pregnancies or dangerous childbirth sometimes decide that divine judgment is a risk they're willing to take. Historians still argue whether medieval women had effective birth control and abortion methods, or whether folklore and wishful thinking produced more hope than results. Some scholars point to recipe books, medical texts, and court records that document widespread use of herbs like pennyroyal, tansy, and savin to control reproduction, suggesting these methods worked at least sometimes. Other researchers emphasize that medieval understanding of reproductive biology was deeply flawed, and many supposed contraceptives or abortifacients were useless or dangerous. meaning women suffered the risks without gaining reliable results. You carrying these herbs don't have access to double-blind studies or clinical trials. You just have stories from other women and hope that ancient knowledge contains at least some truth. The bundle also contains 2 dried roses, their petals brown and brittle but still fragrant when crushed. You added these purely for pleasure, not medical utility, though you could invent a justification if pressed roses are good for the heart. Roses lift melancholy spirits. Roses attract good fortune. Really, you included them because beauty matters, because small luxuries make hard lives bearable, because walking through your day with rose-scented air rising from your pouch reminds you that existence contains more than just survival and obligation. The roses came from the bush growing beside the church door, flowers you plucked after Sunday Mass when no one was watching, a tiny theft you don't feel particularly guilty about since God made the roses and presumably doesn't mind you enjoying them. Medieval streets assault your nose with smells modern people can barely imagine, human waste tossed from windows, animal dung tracked everywhere, unwashed bodies, rotting food in gutters, the sharp tang of tanneries and the greasy smoke from rendering houses where they boil animal carcasses into tallow. Against this olfactory nightmare, your herb bundle provides relief and dignity. When the fish seller's stall becomes overwhelming, you lift your pouch to your nose and breathe lavender instead. When the midden heap near your house ferments in summer heat, you press your sachet against your upper lip and let rue and roses override the stench. These gestures mark you as fastidious, perhaps a bit pretentious, definitely someone who believes herself above wallowing in filth like the unwashed masses. The herbs also serve social and spiritual functions that intertwine with their practical uses. You've been taught that lavender pleases the Virgin Mary, that rue was one of the herbs in Mary's garden at the moment of Annunciation, that roses symbolize her purity and suffering. Carrying these flowers connects you to sacred narratives, makes your daily life feel brushed by holiness, suggests that the Queen of Heaven might notice and approve of your small devotions. This matters more than skeptics realize medieval existence offers few certainties and many terrors. So anything that makes you feel protected by divine attention provides genuine psychological comfort. The line between medicine and magic blurs constantly in your herb bundle. You believe the lavender works partly because of its natural properties, and partly because you blessed it with a prayer to Saint Apollonia, patron of tooth ailments, when your molar started aching last month. You think the rue protects you from plague through some combination of its bitter essence, purifying your blood, and its association with the cross of Christ, repelling demonic disease bringers. This both and thinking frustrates the university-educated physicians who visit your city occasionally, but it makes perfect sense to you why assumed nature and supernature operate in separate spheres when observation suggests they work together. Gathering and preparing herbs follows a calendar that structures your year as reliably as religious festivals. Spring means collecting the first nettles when they're tender enough to eat but potent enough to brew into a spring tonic that thins your winter-thickened blood. Summer brings lavender, roses, and chamomile harvesting during the longest days when sunlight concentrates beneficial properties in flowers and leaves. Autumn demands gathering roots and seeds, angelica root for digestion, fennel seeds for nursing mothers' milk production. Winter means working through your dried stock and planning next year's collecting expeditions. This herbal calendar connects you to seasons and cycles, making you attentive to changes in weather and plant growth that city people increasingly ignore. Your herb bundle has sparked arguments with your husband, who thinks you waste money buying dried flowers from the apothecary when you could spend those pennies on something practical like extra candles or a new cooking pot. You've tried explaining that the herbs are practical, that they prevent disease and improve life quality, but he remains sceptical and occasionally mocking. This tension reflects larger medieval arguments about women's knowledge. The herbs represent folk wisdom passed mother to daughter, old women's tales, superstitious practices that educated men increasingly dismiss as ignorant. Yet when your husband fell ill with fever last year, he accepted the willow bark tea you brewed without complaint, and when his toothache kept him awake for 3 nights, he didn't refuse the clove oil you pressed against his gum. The sachets have worn thin from months of storage in your pouch, and you'll need to replace them soon with fresh linen before the old fabric disintegrates entirely. This maintenance task joins the 1,000 other small jobs that fill your days mending, replacing, renewing, maintaining the fragile infrastructure of medieval life that constantly threatens to collapse into chaos if you stop paying attention for even a moment. You'll sew new sachets next week, transferring the herbs carefully so none of the precious material spills and wastes, blessing the new containers with a quick prayer that they'll protect you as faithfully as their predecessors. The herbs shift and rustle inside their linen wrappings, a sound like whispered secrets or distant rain. You fold the bundle closed and tuck it back into your pouch, feeling its slight weight settle against your keys and coins. The mingled scents of lavender and rue and roses will perfume everything in your bag. Your needles will smell of flowers. Your coins will carry herbal traces. Even your bread crust will absorb hints of your portable garden. This aromatic blending suits you fine. You'd rather your possessions smell of summer meadows than market day crowds. Do you remember that first breath of lavender cutting through street stench? Hold onto it. We're moving next to even more sacred items, the religious tokens that promise to save your soul while emptying your purse. You shift the herb bundle aside and your fingers find something hard and cool, a lead badge no bigger than your thumbnail, stamped with the image of St. Thomas Becket's shrine at Canterbury. You rub your thumb across its raised surface, feeling the crude outline of a cathedral and a kneeling pilgrim, and you remember the exhausting 3-day walk that earned you this token 2 summers ago. Your feet blistered, your back ached, you slept in flea-infested hostel beds and ate stale bread, but you came home with this badge pinned to your hat and a sense that you'd purchased heavenly insurance against whatever sin stained your soul. Pilgrim badges serve multiple purposes in medieval society, functioning simultaneously as proof of devotion, protective talismans, fashion accessories, and social currency. The badge announces that you've made pilgrimage, that you invested time and money and physical suffering in pursuit of spiritual benefit. It separates you from people who've never travelled beyond their village boundaries, marking you as someone with resources enough to afford the journey and piety enough to undertake it. When you wear this badge on your cloak, other pilgrims nod in recognition, fellow travellers who understand the experience you've shared, the terrible hostel food, the aching legs, the moment you first glimpsed the cathedral spire and felt your heart lift despite your exhaustion. The badge also supposedly carries protective power absorbed from proximity to St. Thomas's holy relics. You touched the shrine with your own hands, pressed your palms against the golden casket containing fragments of the martyred archbishop's skull, whispered prayers into the smoky air thick with incense and the breath of thousands of other supplicants. Medieval logic holds that holiness is contagious, that virtue can transfer from sacred objects to common lead through some spiritual process that doesn't require explanation or proof. So your badge isn't just a souvenir, it's a fragment of sanctity you can carry home, a portable piece of Canterbury's blessing that guards you against danger, disease, and demonic attack. Tucked beside the pilgrim badge you find something even more precious and infinitely more questionable, a tiny splinter of wood wrapped in silk thread. supposedly a fragment of the true cross on which Christ died. You purchased this relic from a travelling pardoner who set up his display in the market square last autumn, and you're perhaps 60% certain it's authentic and 40% convinced you were swindled. The pardoner wore impressive robes, spoke Latin phrases you didn't understand, and claimed this splinter came from a monastery in Jerusalem where monks guard the cross fragments with their lives. He also charged you 3 silver pennies, which represented a week's household budget, so you desperately want to believe you bought genuine sanctity rather than a bit of old fence post. Historians still argue whether the trade in religious relics represented sincere faith or cynical fraud. Some scholars emphasize that medieval people genuinely believed in relics' power, and that most sellers probably operated in good faith, offering objects they truly thought were sacred. Other researchers calculate that if every claimed fragment of the true cross were assembled, you'd have enough wood to build several crosses, suggesting that fraud was rampant and gullible believers funded a thriving industry in fake relics. You clutching your splinter don't care about academic debates, you just need to believe that when you die, this relic will testify on your behalf, evidence that you honoured Christ's sacrifice with money you could barely afford to spend. Your pouch also contains 2 small medallions stamped with images of the Virgin Mary, one showing her crowned as Queen of Heaven and the other depicting her cradling the infant Jesus. You bought these at different times for different reasons, the crowned Mary after difficult childbirth that you survived, but your baby didn't. The Madonna and Child when your daughter fell ill with fever and you bargained with heaven for her recovery. These medallions represent contracts with the divine, tangible evidence of promises made and petitions offered. Every time you touch them inside your pouch, you're reminded that supernatural powers watch your struggles and might intervene if properly courted with prayers, donations, and small lead tokens purchased from vendors outside church doors. The economics of religious devotion create a parallel universe of commerce that exists alongside the regular marketplace. Outside every church, shrine, and cathedral, vendors sell badges, medallions, amply filled with holy water, prayers written on parchment, blessings from priests who'll say your name during Mass for the right price. You've spent more money on these spiritual goods than you care to calculate if you added up every penny invested in tokens, relics, indulgences, and votive candles. You could probably afford a new winter cloak or a week's worth of good meat, but cloaks don't reduce your time in purgatory, and meat doesn't protect your children from plague. So you keep buying salvation on the installment plan. A strand of hair from St. Catherine of Alexandria, or so you were told, rests in a tiny vial no larger than your smallest fingernail. The hair is dark and coarse, and you have absolutely no way to verify its authenticity or prove it didn't come from the seller's own head. You bought it anyway, because St. Catherine is the patron of unmarried girls and you're desperate for your daughter to make a good marriage match. Desperate enough to believe that a dead virgin martyr from centuries ago might care about your family's social advancement if you carry a piece of her around in your pouch. The logical part of your mind recognizes the absurdity, but the faithful part clutches at any possibility of heavenly assistance in a world where women have so little control over their destinies. The Church maintains complicated official positions on relics that boil down to they're spiritually powerful when authentic, totally useless when fake, and we're not going to help you tell the difference because that would require admitting how much fraud exists in the system. Priests encourage relic veneration during sermons, warning in the same breath against being deceived by charlatan sellers. This leaves you navigating between devotion and skepticism, trying to honour sacred objects while avoiding obvious scams, hoping that God appreciates your sincere intent even if some of your relics turn out to be worthless junk. Your collection of devotional tokens has grown gradually over years of anxiety, illness, grief, and desperate bargaining with the supernatural. Each piece marks a moment of crisis when you reached for religious comfort, when the uncertainties of medieval life drove you to purchase tangible connections to divine power. The Pilgrim badge commemorates your mother's final illness and your prayer that she'd die peacefully. She did, mercifully, slipping away in her sleep rather than suffering the lingering agony you'd witnessed in other deaths. The true cross splinter marks your husband's accident at the construction site. When falling timber nearly crushed him, he escaped with bruises and you credited miraculous intervention. The crowned Mary medallion represents your lost baby, the daughter who lived 3 days before fever took her, leaving you with empty arms and a conviction that heaven needed another angel more than you needed another child. These objects don't just occupy space in your pouch, they occupy space in your emotional landscape, serving as physical anchors for memories too painful to examine directly. You can't look at your dead baby's face anymore without crying, but you can touch the medallion and feel connected to her through the Virgin Mary, who also lost a son and understands maternal grief. You can't revisit the terror of your husband's near-death without your hands shaking, but you can rub the cross splinter and remember that prayer seemed to work that day, that maybe someone was listening. Medieval religion creates a constant transactional relationship with the divine that might scandalize modern Christians, but makes perfect sense within its own logic. You give prayers, God gives protection. You buy relics, saints intercede on your behalf. You make pilgrimages, heaven reduces your purgatory sentence. This isn't crude materialism, it's practical theology that acknowledges human nature and works with it rather than demanding purely spiritual devotion untainted by worldly concerns. You need tangible objects to hold, visible evidence that your prayers aren't just vanishing into empty air, physical proof that you're doing something to improve your eternal prospects. The tokens clink softly against your keys when you walk, creating a sound that's part commerce and part prayer, the music of medieval faith expressed through metal and belief. Other women hear this sound and understand immediately you're a woman who takes religion seriously, who invests in spiritual insurance, who won't face Judgment Day empty-handed with nothing to show for a lifetime of struggle. The tokens mark you as properly devout without crossing into the excessive piety that makes you socially awkward, or the negligent irreligion that invites gossip about your moral character. You wrap your fingers around the Pilgrim badge one more time, feeling its familiar shape, drawing comfort from its solidity. These tokens won't save you if the plague comes or childbirth goes wrong, but they help you believe that someone beyond this brutal world cares about your suffering and might intervene to ease it. That belief sustains you through days when physical reality offers nothing but grinding labour and slow decay. Do you remember touching the golden shrine at Canterbury, believing for one transcendent moment that sanctity was real and available? Hold that memory. We're shifting now from sacred to vain, from tokens of devotion to tools of beauty. You dig past the devotional tokens and find a small wooden container no bigger than a walnut shell. Its lid carved with a simple flower pattern worn smooth by years of opening and closing. Inside this tiny pot rests a paste the colour of faded roses, made from crushed mulberries mixed with pig fat and a secret ingredient the apothecary's wife wouldn't reveal no matter how much you begged. You dab your finger into the paste and feel its waxy texture. Then lift it to your lips where you press it gently against the lower lip first, then the upper, creating the illusion that your mouth naturally blooms with colour rather than displaying the pale dryness that winter weather inflicts on unprotected skin. Medieval beauty standards create exhausting contradictions that you navigate daily with varying success. The ideal woman according to poems, paintings, and the observations shouted by drunk men in taverns possesses skin as white as snow, cheeks naturally pink as roses, lips red as cherries, hair golden as summer wheat, and a figure neither too thin nor too plump, but mysteriously both delicate and abundantly curved. Nature provides approximately 0 women matching this description, so you resort to cosmetics, dietary manipulation, bleaching treatments, and strategic clothing to approximate an impossible standard. The effort never quite succeeds, but you keep trying because the social penalties for visible aging or plainness include mockery, reduced marriage prospects for your daughters, and the casual dismissal of your opinions in any gathering. The lip paste represents your most daring cosmetic intervention, because it's the most visible and therefore the most likely to attract criticism. The church preaches against women painting their faces, calling it deceptive vanity and satanic pride. You've heard sermons comparing cosmetics to the devil's paintbrushes, suggesting that women who alter their God-given appearance are essentially collaborating with hell. Yet you've also noticed that the merchant's wife wears obvious rouge to Sunday Mass, and nobody seems scandalized. And the nobleman's daughter who sometimes attends your church has eyebrows plucked into thin arches that definitely didn't grow that way naturally. So the rules against cosmetics operate like many medieval rules, absolute in theory, flexible in practice, enforced primarily against women who lack the social standing to ignore them. Your wooden pot also contains a second paste stored in a separate compartment, this one paler and greasier, designed for your cheeks rather than your lips. You mix this paste yourself following a recipe your mother taught you, combining white lead powder with rose water and animal fat, creating a mixture that lightens your sun-darkened skin toward the fashionable pallor that signals you don't work in fields. The white lead is probably poisonous. You've heard rumours about women whose skin turned grey and whose teeth fell out after years of application, but you use it sparingly and hope that moderation prevents the worst effects. Medieval beauty demands sacrifice, and you've decided that slightly poisoning yourself is an acceptable price for looking like someone worthy of respect. Historians still argue whether medieval cosmetics were as toxic as modern analysis suggests, or whether women's bodies adapted to low-level exposure through mechanisms we don't fully understand. Some scholars point to skeletal remains showing lead accumulation in bones, suggesting that cosmetics contributed to chronic health problems and premature death. Other researchers note that millions of women use these products for centuries and most live to reasonable ages, implying that either the toxicity was exaggerated or that benefits outweighed risks in societies where appearance directly affected survival prospects. You applying lead paste to your cheeks don't have access to chemical analysis or long-term health studies. You just know that pale skin opens doors that sun-browned skin keeps closed. The pursuit of light skin creates peculiar behaviour that must seem insane to anyone unfamiliar with medieval beauty culture. You avoid sunlight whenever possible, walking in shadows and wearing wide-brimmed hats that make you look slightly ridiculous but preserve your complexion. You've tried lemon juice applied before bed, milk baths when you can afford to waste the milk, and a terrifying paste made from mercury that you used exactly once before deciding that even beauty has limits. Your obsession with paleness would make sense in a culture that valued indoor leisure over outdoor labour, but you actually spend plenty of time outside. You're just supposed to pretend you don't, to maintain skin suggesting a life of sheltered luxury you'll never actually experience. Tucked beside the cosmetic pots you find a small vial of rose water, clear as spring water but fragrant enough to make your eyes water if you smell it too directly. You use this sparingly, dabbing it behind your ears and along your wrists on special occasions when you need to smell expensive. Rose water serves multiple purposes. It's a perfume that masks the reality that bathing happens irregularly and deodorant doesn't exist. It's a status symbol because distilling roses into water requires equipment and skill most people don't possess. And it's a beauty treatment because sprinkling it on your face supposedly refreshes complexion and tightens pores. Whether it actually does anything besides smell nice is questionable. But the psychological boost of smelling like a garden instead of a stable has genuine value. Medieval hygiene practices exist in a strange space between genuine effort and resigned acceptance of filth. You wash your hands and face daily. You rinse your mouth with water and rub your teeth with a cloth. You change your undermost chemise weekly or whenever it becomes embarrassingly dirty. But full-body bathing happens rarely, maybe monthly if you're fastidious. Maybe quarterly if you follow the medical advice warning that too frequent bathing weakens your constitution by opening pores that should remain closed against disease-bearing air. So you rely on rose water and herbal sachets to create an olfactory illusion of cleanliness, layering pleasant scents over the baseline reality of bodies that rarely touch enough water to actually get clean. The vial of rose water cost you 2 pennies at the apothecary, and you're stretched it across 3 months by using it so sparingly that each application barely qualifies as a gesture. You've considered learning to distill your own rose water, which would be cheaper in the long run, but requires equipment you don't own and skills you haven't mastered. Some women do make their own cosmetics from scratch, gathering ingredients and following recipes passed down through generations. But you've decided that buying professionally made products is worth the expense, because homemade versions sometimes go rancid or separate into unusable layers, or simply don't work as advertised. Your pouch also contains a small ivory comb, its teeth fine enough to catch and remove lice but not so fine that they break against your thick hair. You're probably supposed to keep this comb in a separate container to protect it from damage. But you've decided that convenience outweighs preservation. You need access to the comb throughout the day when you feel your carefully arranged braids starting to loosen or when you suspect something is crawling in your hair. The comb represents a significant investment. Ivory comes from elephant tusks shipped from Africa or walrus tusks from the frozen north. Either way, travelling enormous distances before reaching the craftsman who carved this delicate object. You inherited this comb from your mother-in-law as part of your wedding gifts, and you'll pass it to your daughter when she marries, assuming you don't break it before then through careless handling. Using the comb requires privacy and patience that daytime activities rarely provide, so you mostly do your serious hair work by candlelight after supper, when you can sit still and work methodically through tangles without rushing. You section your hair carefully, comb each section from bottom to top to avoid creating worse snarls, and inspect the comb's teeth for captured lice that need to be crushed between your thumbnails. This grooming ritual provides odd satisfaction in the systematic working through of problems. The visible improvement, the moment when your hair finally flows smoothly through the comb's teeth and you can coil it into neat braids again. Medieval beauty culture includes practices so strange that modern people would assume you're joking if you described them honestly. Some women pluck their hairlines back several inches to create higher foreheads, which supposedly look more noble and intelligent. Others use belladonna drops in their eyes to dilate pupils into the wide-eyed look associated with sexual arousal and youthful innocence. You've heard of women drinking vinegar to achieve fashionable thinness. applying chicken fat to encourage breast growth, and sleeping with raw meat on their faces to reduce wrinkles. You've tried exactly none of these techniques because they sound either painful or insane. But you don't judge the women desperate enough to attempt them. Beauty is currency in your world, and some women need every advantage they can manufacture. The wooden pot's lid clicks shut with a satisfying sound as you finish touching up your lips and return the cosmetics to your pouch. Your face now presents a carefully constructed version of yourself, not exactly deceptive, but definitely enhanced, like a manuscript illumination that captures the essence of a scene while adding golden light that never existed in reality. You touch your lips experimentally and feel the slight tackiness of the paste. A reminder that beauty requires constant maintenance, and that the moment you stop performing femininity, the performance collapses and reveals the ordinary woman beneath. Do you remember that first time you saw yourself in a mirror and realised you could change what you saw? Speaking of mirrors, they're coming next, along with the other vanity tools that let you see what everyone else sees when they look at you. You push aside the cosmetic containers and your fingers encounter something cool and circular, a polished metal disc the size of a small apple, its surface reflecting distorted light even here in the depths of your pouch. You lift out the mirror carefully, holding it by its decorative handle carved from bone, and tilt it to catch the ambient glow filtering through the market's canvas awnings. Your face appears in the metal, warped slightly by imperfections in the polishing but recognizable enough to check whether the lip paste has smeared or your veil has shifted askew during the morning's errands. Medieval mirrors bear little resemblance to the flawless glass reflections modern people take for granted. Your mirror is polished bronze, buffed to a shine by the metalworker who sold it to you. But the surface has already begun to tarnish in the months since purchase, despite your efforts to keep it clean. The reflection it provides is murky and indistinct, more like seeing yourself in dark water than looking through a window. You can detect major problems: food stuck in your teeth, a smudge of dirt on your cheek, hair escaping from its braids, but you can't achieve the precise self-examination that clear glass would permit. This vagueness actually provides mercy, you've decided, because you're not entirely certain you want to see yourself with perfect clarity. The church maintains a complicated relationship with mirrors that manages to be both condemnatory and pragmatic. Priests thunder about vanity and self-regard, warning that excessive mirror-gazing reveals dangerous pride and self-love. They cite biblical passages about inner beauty mattering more than outer appearance. Stories of saints who deliberately avoided mirrors to maintain proper humility. Yet these same priests acknowledge that women need to verify their appearances are modest and appropriate before entering church or appearing in public, so mirrors become simultaneously sinful tools of vanity and necessary instruments of propriety. You navigate this contradiction by using your mirror quickly and purposefully, checking your appearance without lingering over it, maintaining the fiction that you're ensuring modesty rather than admiring yourself. Your mirror hangs from a short chain attached to your pouch, the metal links allowing it to dangle freely while preventing loss if you drop it. This attachment method also serves a social purpose. The visible mirror announces that you own one, marking you as someone with disposable income and concern for appearance. Peasant women don't carry mirrors. They check their reflections in water buckets or polished pots if they bother checking at all. Merchant wives and minor nobility carry mirrors openly, displaying them as casual accessories that suggest wealth without requiring ostentatious jewellery. You fall into this middle category, using the mirror's visibility to signal your social position while avoiding the truly expensive silver mirrors that would mark you as pretentious above your station. Historians still argue whether medieval people had substantially different relationships with their own appearances compared to modern humans with constant access to perfect reflections. Some scholars suggest that limited mirror access meant medieval people possessed less developed self-images and worried less about minor imperfections, living with a healthy distance from their physical selves. Other researchers counter that humans have always been conscious of appearance and that medieval people simply used different methods: still water, other people's reactions, occasional mirror glimpses to construct self-knowledge. You checking your wavering reflection can't resolve this academic debate, but you know that seeing yourself matters, that the mirror provides information you crave, even when the image it returns is imperfect and unflattering. The mirror has witnessed your aging in its distorted surface. When you first purchased it 3 years ago, you examined your face with the curiosity of seeing yourself clearly for the first time in months. You'd relied on your husband's shaving mirror previously, sneaking glances when he wasn't looking. Now you notice changes that the dim reflection can't entirely hide: lines forming at the corners of your eyes from squinting in sunlight, a hardness around your mouth that wasn't there before your baby died, grey hairs multiplying at your temples faster than you can pluck them out. The mirror documents time's passage in a way that daily gradual change obscures, and sometimes you wish you couldn't see the evidence so plainly. Beside the mirror in your pouch rests a small pair of tweezers, their tips meeting with precision thanks to the smith who forged them from a single piece of iron, bent and shaped until it could grip individual hairs. You use these tweezers for multiple purposes, plucking the stray hairs that sprout on your chin as you age, removing splinters embedded in your fingers from daily work, and occasionally performing the fashionable eyebrow shaping that requires pulling out hairs one by one until you achieve thin arches instead of the natural fullness that marks you as unsophisticated. The tweezing hurts every single time. Your eyes water from the sharp pain, but you've accepted this discomfort as the price of beauty, just as you've accepted the burn of lye soap and the chill of winter washing water. The tweezers also serve a grimmer purpose that you don't discuss in polite company, removing lice and their eggs from your hair when infestations become serious enough to require individual extraction. You've spent countless evenings sitting in good light with your mirror propped against a book, systematically searching through sections of hair for the tiny parasites, crushing them between your thumbnails when you find them, using the tweezers to grip nits stuck to hair shafts too firmly for fingers to dislodge. This battle against vermin is one you'll never completely win in a world where bathing is infrequent and crowded living conditions ensure constant reinfestation. But you fight it anyway because surrendering to lice feels like surrendering to degradation itself. Your pouch also contains a tiny vial of scented oil, barely enough to fill a thimble, that you apply to your hair to add shine and manageability. The oil smells of almonds and roses, a combination you find pleasant enough to justify the expense, even though you're not entirely convinced it improves your hair's appearance. Medieval hair care involves a lot of hope and dubious remedies, you've heard. Women swear that washing hair in beer adds volume, that applying egg yolks promotes growth, that sleeping with your hair wrapped in silk prevents damage. You've tried most of these techniques with mixed results, ultimately deciding that clean hair brushed regularly and protected from excessive sun matters more than any miracle treatment. The relationship between grooming tools and social class creates visible hierarchies that everyone can read instantly. Your bronze mirror and iron tweezers mark you as comfortably middle tier, above the poverty that can't afford any vanity implements, but below the wealth that owns silver mirrors and gold tweezers. You've seen the contents of noble women's grooming kits, ivory combs inlaid with precious metals, mirrors framed in jewelled cases, tweezers so delicate they look like jewellery themselves, These luxury items serve the same basic functions as your simpler versions, but they announce that the owner values beauty enough to invest serious money in its pursuit and possesses enough wealth to afford the investment. Using grooming tools in public sends complicated social signals that you've learned to calibrate carefully. Checking your mirror discreetly suggests appropriate concern for modest appearance. Staring into it too long implies narcissism and vanity. Using tweezers to remove a splinter is acceptable. Using them to pluck eyebrows in public crosses into inappropriate intimate grooming that should happen privately. You've internalized these rules through observation and occasional embarrassment, like the time you spent too long examining your reflection at market and a woman you barely knew made a loud comment about peacocks and pride that made everyone nearby laugh at your expense. The mirror has become such a constant companion that you feel oddly vulnerable without it, as if you're walking around with your appearance potentially disastrous and no way to verify or correct problems. On the rare occasions when you leave the house without your pouch running to a neighbour's house in an emergency, stepping into the garden for herbs, you experience low-level anxiety about your appearance that only resolves when you return to mirror access. This dependence on reflected self-knowledge would probably amuse your grandmother, who lived most of her life with only occasional glimpses of herself in still water, and apparently survived just fine without constant verification that she looked presentable. The bronze surface requires regular maintenance to prevent complete tarnishing. Every few weeks you spend an evening polishing the mirror with a soft cloth and a paste made from chalk dust and vinegar, working in small circles until the metal brightens and your reflection sharpens into something approaching clarity. This maintenance feels meditative, a repetitive task that produces visible improvement and requires no complex decision-making. You've noticed that you tend to polish your mirror when you're anxious or upset about other things, finding comfort in the simple cause and effect of effort producing shine. Your daughter sometimes asks to look in your mirror, and you let her sparingly because you remember your own childhood fascination with seeing yourself reflected. She makes faces, examines her teeth, practices expressions she has observed in adult women. You watch her discovering vanity in real time and feel torn between wanting to protect her from caring too much about appearance and knowing that she'll need those skills to survive in a world that judges women primarily on their looks. So you let her play with the mirror but limit the time, trying to find some balance between crushing her natural curiosity and encouraging unhealthy obsession. Do you remember the first time you saw your whole face clearly? Not just fragments glimpsed in water. The mirror goes back now we're moving to sweeter things, the tokens and trinkets that make your heart race, for reasons having nothing to do with piety or practicality. You reach past the mirror and your fingers brush against something soft and precious, deliberately hidden at the very bottom of your pouch where casual searching won't immediately reveal it, a silk ribbon the colour of spring leaves, worn at the edges from being handled too often by fingers that have no business touching it. You pull it out slowly, feeling its smoothness against your work-roughened skin, and you remember exactly when and how this ribbon came into your possession. A young man with dark eyes and an apprentice carpenter's calloused hands pressed it into your palm 3 years ago, before your father arranged your marriage to the merchant's son who could afford a proper dowry settlement, before you became a wife with responsibilities and a reputation to protect. The ribbon represents everything you're not supposed to feel and definitely not supposed to keep. Medieval morality demands that you forget previous attachments once marriage vows are spoken, that you transfer all affection to your husband regardless of whether your heart cooperates, that you destroy any evidence of earlier romantic interests that might cast doubt on your virtue or loyalty. You know these rules intimately, you've heard them preached from pulpits, whispered by married women offering advice, stated bluntly by your mother the week before your wedding, yet here the ribbon remains, hidden but not discarded, a small rebellion against the expectation that you can simply erase feelings because circumstances demand it. The carpenter's apprentice gave you this ribbon after months of carefully orchestrated encounters that had to appear accidental lest anyone suspect courtship was happening. You'd arrange to walk past his master's workshop at specific times. He'd find excuses to deliver finished work to houses near yours. You'd both attend the same church services and position yourselves where eye contact was possible but not obvious. The ribbon exchange happened in the market crowd during the autumn fair, his hand brushing yours as he transferred the silk, his whispered words lost in the noise but his meaning perfectly clear. You wore that ribbon in your hair exactly once, for a single afternoon when you knew you'd see him, before hiding it away when your father announced your engagement to someone wealthier and more suitable. Historians still argue whether medieval marriages based on practical arrangements rather than romantic love caused genuine suffering, or whether people simply had different expectations about marriage and didn't miss passionate attachment they'd never been taught to expect. Some scholars emphasize the evidence of unhappy arranged marriages, forced unions, and women trapped with men they could barely tolerate, suggesting that pragmatic matchmaking created widespread misery. Other researchers point out that many arranged marriages developed into genuine partnerships, that medieval people distinguished between marital affection and romantic passion, and that expecting marriage to provide emotional fulfillment is itself a modern notion that medieval people might have found strange. You living inside an arranged marriage that's neither terrible nor wonderful can't resolve this debate. You're fond of your husband in a companionable way. You don't regret marrying him exactly, but the ribbon reminds you that fondness and passion are entirely different emotions. The ribbon isn't the only sentimental item hiding in your pouch. Wrapped in a scrap of linen, you find 3 pressed flowers harebells picked during a Saint's Day festival 2 summers ago when you and the carpenter's apprentice managed to walk in the same meadow group without anyone noticing how often you drifted toward each other. The flowers have faded to brown ghosts of their former blue beauty, brittle enough that you're afraid to unfold the linen completely lest they crumble into dust. You save them anyway because they mark a specific afternoon of possibility, a moment when you allowed yourself to imagine a different future where your father might permit you to marry for affection rather than economic advantage. Medieval women's sentimental attachments operate in a shadow economy that everyone knows exists, but polite society pretends doesn't. You're supposed to be completely absorbed in wifely duties and maternal responsibilities, your emotional energy wholly invested in your husband and children. The reality is messier. You carry tokens from a man you didn't marry. You sometimes dream about the life you might have lived. You occasionally see him in the market and your heart performs acrobatics that have nothing to do with marital devotion. These feelings don't mean you're a bad wife or that your marriage is failing, just that human emotions refuse to be controlled by social expectations or legal contracts. The ribbon has survived 3 years of hiding through a combination of luck and paranoia. You've moved it repeatedly to different locations within your pouch as you add or remove other items, always ensuring it stays buried beneath more innocent objects. You've removed it and contemplated throwing it away at least a dozen times, particularly during attacks of guilt when you feel like keeping it represents a betrayal of your marriage vows. You've even walked to the midden heap once with the ribbon clutched in your fist, fully intending to toss it into the garbage, before changing your mind at the last moment and stuffing it back into hiding. The ribbon persists because you're not quite ready to destroy the last physical evidence that someone once desired you for yourself, rather than for your dowry or family connections. Tucked alongside the ribbon, you find a small wooden token carved with initials not your initials or your husband's. but rather a set belonging to a friend from childhood who moved to another city when her family's fortunes changed. She gave you this token the day she left, promising to write letters and maintain the friendship despite distance. You've received exactly 3 letters in the 5 years since she departed, and you've written 4 in return, but the correspondence has dwindled as your lives diverged and you ran out of shared experiences to discuss. The token remains as evidence of a friendship that mattered intensely during adolescence, but has faded into nostalgic memory. The way most childhood bonds eventually dissolve under the pressure of adult responsibilities and geographic separation. The collection of sentimental objects creates a secret history that contradicts your public narrative. Outwardly, you're a merchant's wife whose life began at marriage and whose concerns centre entirely on household management and child-rearing. These hidden tokens tell a different story. You were a girl who attracted romantic attention. You had friendships that shaped your personality. You made choices and experienced losses that continue affecting you despite society's expectation that you forget anything that happened before your wedding day. The tokens preserve a version of yourself that no longer exists publicly but refuses to disappear completely. Medieval society offers women almost no acceptable outlets for processing emotional complexity. You can't discuss your feelings about the carpenter's apprentice with your husband. That conversation would create suspicion and hurt without producing any useful outcome. You can't confess to your priest that you keep love tokens from another man. He'd prescribe penances and lecture you about proper wifely submission. You can't even share these secrets with female friends because gossip spreads too easily and reputation damage is permanent. So you carry these objects in silence, touching them occasionally to remind yourself that your internal life contains more depth and complication than your external role suggests. The ribbon feels thinner each time you handle it, the silk fibres degrading from repeated folding and the oils from your fingers. Eventually it will disintegrate completely, becoming too fragile to survive even gentle touching, and you will have to decide whether to preserve the fragments in some other container or finally let them go. Part of you looks forward to that decision being made for you by time and decay. The ribbon can disappear without you actively choosing to destroy it, allowing you to maintain the fiction that you would have kept it forever if only it had remained intact. You've sometimes wondered what happened to the carpenter's apprentice. Did he finish his training and open his own workshop? Did he marry someone his family chose? Just as you did. Does he ever think about the girl he gave a ribbon to during an autumn fair? Or has he completely forgotten you in the years since your paths diverged? You'll probably never know the answers to these questions, and perhaps that's better. The ribbon preserves a moment of possibility without the disappointing reality of how most possibilities collapse into ordinary conclusions. The pressed flowers and wooden token join the ribbon as you carefully rewrap the linen package and return everything to the bottom of your pouch. Burial layers of keys and coins and practical items concealing these impractical treasures. Your fingers linger for just a moment on the silk before you force yourself to move on, to return attention to the present moment and the errands that still need completing. Sentiment is a luxury you can visit briefly but can't afford to inhabit. There's shopping to finish, meals to prepare, children to supervise, and a husband who expects you home before dark. Do you remember that autumn afternoon when possibility felt real and choices seemed open rather than predetermined? Keep that feeling close. We're shifting now to objects of authority, the seals and signatures that prove you're someone worth taking seriously. You shake yourself free from sentimental reverie, and your fingers find something hard and official, a brass signet ring small enough to fit your smallest finger, its surface carved with the simple geometric pattern that serves as your personal mark. You slip the ring onto your finger and press your thumb against its face, feeling the raised design that will transfer into soft wax when you seal a letter or document, creating a stamp of authenticity that announces this message came from you and no forger. The ring transforms you from a woman whose words might be dismissed into someone whose communications carry weight and legal standing, at least in theory. Medieval signatures don't exist the way modern people understand them. Most people can't write their names consistently enough to create a recognizable mark. And literacy rates hover around 10% even in cities where education has better access than rural areas. Instead, you use seals to authenticate documents, pressing your signet ring into melted wax to create an impression unique enough to identify while simple enough that you can reproduce it consistently. Your geometric pattern consists of 3 interlocking circles, a design you chose partly because it looks reasonably attractive and partly because it's difficult to forge without access to your actual ring. The circles represent nothing symbolic or meaningful. You just needed a pattern the metalworker could carve clearly and you could remember easily. The ring grants you authority that medieval women rarely possessed the ability to conduct business correspondence, send binding agreements, and participate in transactions without requiring a man to authenticate on your behalf. Technically, in many legal contexts, your husband should be handling this correspondence and his seal should appear on documents. Practically, he's often away on business and you're managing the household finances, responding to creditors, arranging purchases, and generally keeping everything functioning despite his absence. So you've started using your own seal more frequently, testing whether recipients will accept your authority or demand mail validation, discovering that most people care more about getting paid than about whose seal appears on the payment authorization. Beside the signet ring in your pouch, you carry several small cakes of sealing wax, each no larger than a coin but containing enough material for multiple uses. The wax comes in red, which is the standard colour for most correspondence, though you've heard that noble families use green or even black wax to signal their elevated status. Your red wax came from the stationer who sells parchment and writing supplies near the cathedral, and it smells faintly of the beeswax and resin mixture that gives it the proper melting point and flexibility. You've learned through trial and error that sealing wax needs to be hot enough to flow smoothly, but not so hot that it spatters dangerously, and you've burned your fingers enough times to respect the process. Historians still argue whether medieval women's use of personal seals represented genuine autonomy or merely performed authority while actual power remained in male hands. Some scholars point to thousands of extant documents bearing women's seals, suggesting widespread female participation in legal and economic activities that official histories often overlook. Other researchers note that many of these seals appear alongside male family members' marks, indicating that women's authority operated under supervision or required male approval even when women nominally controlled transactions. You pressing your ring into wax don't care about academic debates. You just know that your seal gets results, that merchants honour your orders, and that your word carries weight when backed by the brass circle on your finger. The mechanics of sealing letters involve more skill than you initially expected. You must heat the wax carefully, usually by holding it near a candle flame until it begins to soften, then quickly pressing it against the parchment or paper where you want the seal to appear. The wax cools rapidly, giving you only seconds to press your ring firmly into the molten blob before it hardens into an unusable lump. Press too hard and the wax squishes out into an ugly mess. Press too lightly and the pattern doesn't transfer clearly enough to be readable. You've ruined countless seals through mistiming and improper pressure, wasting wax and having to scrape it off and start over while the candle burns down and you curse your clumsiness. Your pouch also contains a small wooden case protecting a wax tablet, 2 thin boards hinged together like a book. The inner surface is coated with dark beeswax that accepts impressions from a metal stylus. You use this tablet for temporary notes and calculations that don't require permanent parchment, scratching shopping lists and expense tracking into the wax, then warming the tablet gently near the fire to melt the wax smooth again when you need a clean surface. The tablet saves you money because parchment costs dearly and you can't afford to waste it on ephemeral notes. But it also limits what you can preserve once you melt the wax. Whatever you wrote disappears forever unless you've transferred the information elsewhere. The stylus for writing on wax tablets lives in a leather loop attached to the wooden case, a pointed metal rod with one sharp end for inscribing and one flat end for erasing mistakes by smoothing the wax. You've developed your own abbreviated notation system for tracking household accounts on the tablet symbols representing common purchases. Shorthand versions of vendor names, numerical marks that make sense to you but would confuse anyone else trying to read your notes. This private code gives you control over information flow. Your husband can demand to see the accounts, but interpreting your notation requires you to translate, allowing you to emphasize certain expenditures while minimizing others you'd prefer he not scrutinize too closely. Medieval literacy creates complicated hierarchies that you navigate carefully. You can read well enough to handle household correspondence and religious texts, but your writing is laboured and your spelling inconsistent enough that you prefer dictating letters to the parish scribe rather than composing them yourself. The scribe charges a penny per letter but provides neat handwriting and proper Latin phrases that make your correspondence look professional rather than amateurish. You've considered improving your writing through practice, but time is scarce, and the return on investment seems minimal when you can pay someone to produce better results than you'd achieve through months of effort. The signet ring has become such a symbol of your authority that you feel oddly powerless without it. On the rare occasions when you've misplaced the ring, usually by removing it while kneading bread dough and forgetting where you set it down, you experience genuine anxiety until it's recovered. The ring isn't particularly valuable as jewellery. The brass is worth maybe a few pennies melted down. But its symbolic power far exceeds its material worth, and losing it would mean commissioning a replacement with the same pattern, explaining to everyone why your seal suddenly looks different, and enduring the period of transition when people might question whether documents are genuinely from you. The act of sealing a letter carries ritualistic weight that transforms casual correspondence into official communication. When you press your ring into hot wax, you're not just closing a letter, you're asserting your identity, claiming authorship, declaring that these words represent your will and deserve recipient attention. The seal says I exist, I have authority, I expect to be taken seriously. For a medieval woman whose legal existence is often subsumed under her husband's or father's identity, this assertion matters more than modern people with driver's licenses and social security numbers can easily understand. Your wax tablet currently contains a partially completed shopping list for tomorrow's market trip: flour, eggs, the root vegetables whose specific names you've abbreviated to single letters, and a reminder to ask the fishmonger whether he'll have fresh pike this week. The list exists in a liminal state between thought and documentation, substantial enough to prevent forgetting but temporary enough that it will vanish once you've completed the errands. This impermanence suits the information you don't need permanent records of routine purchases. Just enough structure to organize your day and prevent the frustrating experience of returning home and realizing you forgot something essential. The wooden case protecting your wax tablet has developed cracks from years of opening and closing, and you've reinforced it with leather strips wound around the edges to prevent complete separation. The case will eventually fail completely despite your repairs, forcing you to commission a new tablet from the carpenter, but you're extending its life as long as possible through maintenance and care. This repair rather than replace philosophy governs most of your relationship with possessions. Nothing is disposable. Everything gets used until it literally cannot function anymore, and premature replacement represents wasteful extravagance you can't afford and wouldn't choose even if you could. The brass ring catches candlelight when you move your hand, flashing briefly before returning to dull metal. You twist it on your finger, feeling its comfortable weight, its assertion that you matter enough to mark documents with your personal symbol. The ring doesn't make you equal to men in legal or social standing, but it gives you a tool for claiming whatever authority medieval society grudgingly permits women to exercise. That's not nothing in a world determined to render women invisible. Do you remember the first time you sealed a letter and watched the recipient accept it without question? Hold that moment of recognition. We're moving now to more practical tools, the knives and utensils that let you eat like a civilized person. You shift the sealing wax aside and your fingers close around something you use multiple times. Daily, a small eating knife with a wooden handle worn smooth by years of gripping, its blade no longer than your palm but sharp enough to slice through bread, cheese, or the occasional piece of meat that appears on your trencher. This knife never leaves your pouch because medieval dining assumes you'll bring your own utensils. Hosts provide food and sometimes serving implements, but carving your portion and conveying it to your mouth is your personal responsibility. The knife makes you self-sufficient at any table, able to participate in meals without depending on borrowed tools or using your fingers exclusively like a child or a peasant. The blade shows its age through a slight curve worn into the cutting edge from thousands of sharpenings against the whetstone you keep in your kitchen. When you first acquired this knife, a wedding gift from your grandmother who understood practical necessities better than your parents, with their focus on decorative linens, the blade was straight and gleamed like silver in candlelight. 5 years of use have transformed it into something more personal and less perfect, a tool shaped by your specific cutting habits and sharpening technique. The curve actually improves its functionality for certain tasks, particularly slicing soft cheese or cutting through the crust of hard bread, though you suspect a bladesmith would find the irregular edge evidence of poor maintenance. Medieval table manners revolve heavily around proper knife usage, creating elaborate rules that separate refined diners from crude ones. You've learned never to clean your knife on the tablecloth, to wipe it instead on your bread trencher or a napkin if one's provided. You know not to pick your teeth with your knife point, though you've definitely seen men do this at informal meals when they think no one important is watching. You understand that pointing your knife at another diner suggests aggression, that gesturing with it during conversation marks you as low class, and that laying it down between bites rather than clutching it throughout the meal signals breeding and education. These rules exhaust you sometimes with their fussiness, but you follow them because your husband's business depends on maintaining respectable appearances when dining with merchants and guild members. The knife serves double duty as both eating implement and general purpose tool. You've used it to cut thread when your scissors were unavailable, to scrape mud from your shoes, to pry open stuck cabinet doors, to trim candle wicks, and once to defend yourself when a drunk man followed you too closely through a dark alley. That last use required no actual violence, just displaying the blade with enough confidence that he reassessed whether harassing you was worth the risk of injury. The knife's defensive capability provides psychological comfort every time you walk through questionable neighborhoods. You're not helpless. You're armed with at least a small blade that could do damage if circumstances became desperate. Historians still argue whether medieval people had better or worse table manners than their modern descendants. Some scholars point to elaborate etiquette guides and courtesy books that prescribed refined behaviours, suggesting that medieval elites took dining decorum very seriously. Other researchers note that many of these rules existed precisely because people needed extensive instruction to avoid disgusting behaviours. Don't spit on the table. Don't blow your nose in the tablecloth. Don't gnaw bones and throw them on the floor, suggesting that actual practice often fell short of prescribed ideals. You've witnessed both extremes: formal dinners where everyone performs elaborate courtesy, and casual family meals where your husband belches freely and your children grab food with greasy fingers. Your pouch also contains a small wooden spoon, carved from a single piece of beechwood and polished smooth through use. Medieval meals don't provide individual spoons any more than they provide individual knives, so you bring your own for soups, porridges, and the various semi-liquid dishes that appear regularly on your table. The spoon is simpler than your knife, just a handle and a shallow bowl. Nothing decorative or elaborate, but it serves essential functions that fingers and bread cannot accomplish. You've tried eating pottage with bread alone, sopping up the thick mixture and conveying it to your mouth, but it's messy and inefficient compared to spooning. The spoon represents a level of civilization that you're determined to maintain, despite the constant pressure of medieval life toward cruder expedients. You could eat with your hands exclusively. Many people do. But you've decided that using proper utensils marks an important boundary between yourself and the poverty that constantly threatens to swallow families like yours. The spoon says we haven't descended into desperate survival mode. We still observe niceties. We're managing to preserve standards despite economic pressures and social uncertainty. This assertion might be partly performative, but performance becomes reality when you repeat it consistently enough. Cleaning your eating utensils happens casually and imperfectly by modern standards. You wipe your knife and spoon on a cloth after meals. Occasionally rinse them in water, and consider them clean enough for the next use. You don't have access to soap specifically for washing dishes. That's a luxury reserved for laundry and body washing when you can afford it. Your utensils accumulate a patina of old food oils and residues that would horrify modern health inspectors, but that doesn't concern you particularly. Everyone's utensils carry the same accumulation, and medieval people don't connect these residues to illness the way modern germ theory would suggest they should. The knife's handle has cracked slightly where the wooden grip meets the metal tang, and you've wrapped it with thin strips of leather to prevent complete separation. This repair will hold for months or maybe years, but eventually the handle will fail entirely, and you'll need to commission a new one from the cutler who works near the tannery. You're dreading that expense. A good eating knife costs several pennies, a significant investment for the household operating on tight margins. But the knife is non-negotiable equipment for participating in social meals, so you'll find the money somehow when replacement becomes unavoidable. Medieval banquets create situations where knife skills become public performances evaluated by everyone present. When you dine at your husband's employer's house, you're acutely aware that hosts and fellow guests are observing how competently you carve your meat, whether you can slice through tough cuts without sawing awkwardly, if you can spear food pieces on your knife point and convey them to your mouth without dripping sauce down your chin. You've practiced these skills until they're mostly automatic. But the awareness of being watched creates performance anxiety that sometimes makes your hands less steady than they'd be during casual family meals. Your daughter is just reaching the age where she needs her own eating knife. and you've been teaching her proper usage with a smaller blade you borrowed from your neighbour. She's enthusiastic but clumsy, frequently dropping the knife or cutting herself on the blade when she grabs it carelessly. You remember your own apprenticeship in knife skills, the sliced fingers, the frustration of trying to cut meat that wouldn't cooperate, the embarrassment of fumbling in front of relatives who seemed effortlessly graceful with their utensils. Watching your daughter struggle through the same learning process creates sympathy and impatience in equal measure. You want her to master these skills quickly, but you remember that mastery requires time and repeated failure. The social rules around lending eating utensils create delicate etiquette problems. If you attend a meal and discover that another diner lacks proper tools, offering to share your knife seems generous and Christian, but there's always the risk that the borrower will damage or lose your implement, leaving you without essential equipment until you can afford replacement. You've loaned your spoon exactly once to a distant cousin attending your daughter's baptism feast, and spent the entire meal anxious that she'd drop it or walk away with it accidentally. She returned it safely, but the stress convinced you that future generosity would have limits. The knife also appears in your religious observances more often than you'd initially expect. You use it to cut bread during household prayers, symbolically reenacting the Last Supper when Christ broke bread with disciples. You employ it to trim candle wicks before lighting them for evening devotions, ensuring the flame burns cleanly and brightly. You've even used it to carve a small cross into the family Bible's wooden cover, marking it as your household's particular copy in a world where books are rare enough that any volume might walk away if not clearly claimed. The knife's presence in both sacred and mundane contexts doesn't create contradiction in your mind. Medieval life refuses to separate spiritual and practical concerns into neat categories. The blade needs sharpening again. You can feel its edge has dulled from cutting yesterday's particularly crusty bread. You'll spend a few minutes tomorrow dragging it across the whetstone, maintaining the angle your grandmother taught you, working until the edge catches on your thumbnail when you test it carefully. This maintenance ritual connects you to the generations of women who've kept blades sharp, who've understood that tools require care and attention to remain functional, who've passed down knowledge about proper angles and consistent pressure and testing for sharpness without cutting yourself too badly. Do you remember the first time you successfully carved meat at a formal dinner without embarrassing yourself? Hold that small triumph. We're moving now into stranger territory. The charms and talismans that blur the line between religion and magic. You push past the eating knife and discover objects you wouldn't discuss with your priest: a smooth stone with a natural hole through its centre, a rabbit's foot dried and stiff, and a small iron nail bent into a crude protective shape. These items occupy an uncomfortable space between Christian devotion and older practices that the Church condemns as superstition or worse. Yet nearly every woman you know carries similar tokens tucked away where prying eyes won't immediately discover them. You wrap your fingers around the holed stone, feeling its cool weight, remembering the morning you found it in the stream bed and knew immediately that it was special, touched by forces that predate cathedrals and Latin prayers. The stone with the hole, some people call them hag stones or witch stones or fairy stones, depending on which tradition they're drawing from, supposedly protects against nightmares, evil spirits, and the malicious magic that jealous neighbours might direct toward your household. You've been taught that looking through the hole lets you see things hidden from normal vision fairies in the garden, curses hanging in the air like spider webs, the true nature of people who smile while harbouring ill will. You've never actually seen anything supernatural through the hole, but you've looked through it dozens of times just in case, squinting at your surroundings with one eye pressed against the cold stone, hoping for revelation that never quite arrives. Medieval Christianity exists in uneasy alliance with older beliefs that refuse to die despite centuries of official condemnation. The Church insists that only God and his saints possess power to protect or harm, that appealing to stones and animal parts represents paganism and devil worship. Yet the same priests who preach against superstition will bless your fields to ensure good harvest, sprinkle holy water to drive out demons, and sell you relics that supposedly cure illness through proximity to dead saints' body parts. The distinction between acceptable Christian magic and forbidden pagan magic seems largely about who controls the supernatural transaction, rather than any fundamental difference in the underlying logic. The rabbit's foot came from an animal your husband trapped last spring, and you claimed the left hind foot specifically because folk wisdom insists that only the left hind foot carries protective power. Right feet or front feet are useless for luck-bringing purposes. You dried the foot over your kitchen fire, letting smoke and heat preserve it into the hard relic you now carry. The rabbit died during a full moon, which supposedly enhances the foot's potency. Though you're not entirely certain whether you remember the moon phase correctly, or whether you've convinced yourself it was full because you need to believe the charm works. Historians still argue whether medieval people genuinely believed in folk magic or merely hedged their bets by practicing both Christian devotion and older protection simultaneously. Some scholars suggest that medieval cosmology made no clear distinction between religion and magic, that people believed in a universe where supernatural forces operated constantly, and obtaining protection required employing every available tool. Other researchers propose that many people recognized folk practices as superstitious nonsense, but participated anyway because social pressure and residual anxiety made ignoring potential protections feel too risky. You carrying these charms can't resolve academic debates. You just know that the world feels dangerous and unpredictable, and refusing any possible protection seems foolish when your children's lives might depend on it. The bent iron nail came from a crossroads where two paths meet, collected at midnight on St. John's Eve when the boundary between natural and supernatural supposedly thins enough that ordinary objects absorb magical properties. You walk to that crossroads alone despite your fear, despite knowing that respectable women don't wander roads at midnight, despite your husband's complaints that you were being ridiculous. You found several nails scattered in the dirt where carts and horses had passed, selected one that felt right in your hand, and bent it into a crude protective shape before dawn could dispel whatever power it had accumulated during the night. Your collection of protective charms also includes a small cloth bag containing salt mixed with herbs. Sewn shut and blessed with words you learned from your grandmother, words that aren't quite prayers and aren't quite spells, but exist in some undefined category between the two. You're supposed to keep this bag near your bed to prevent nightmares and protect against spirits that walk while households sleep. You followed this instruction faithfully for 3 years, and you haven't had any terrifying dreams during that time, though you're aware that correlation doesn't prove causation, and you might simply have been lucky. The Church's campaign against folk magic has intensified during your lifetime, with priests increasingly denouncing practices they previously tolerated as harmless peasant traditions. You've heard sermons warning that using charms and amulets demonstrates lack of faith in God's providence, that seeking protection from stones and animal parts insults Christ's sacrifice and suggests that his redemption isn't sufficient for your needs. These arguments make you uncomfortable because they contain enough truth to sting if you truly believed God protected the faithful. Would you need a rabbit's foot? Yet abandoning the charms feels terrifying, like removing armor during battle and hoping your enemies will choose not to attack. The boundary between protective charms and cursing implements is uncomfortably thin in medieval magic. The same knowledge that lets you ward off evil can theoretically be reversed to send harm toward enemies. You know women who whisper about revenge spells and justice magic, who claim they can cause milk to sour in a rival's churn or make an enemy's husband stray. You've never attempted anything malicious yourself, or at least that's what you tell yourself. Conveniently forgetting the time you buried an object near your sister-in-law's house while muttering words you'd rather not remember, nothing happened, which either proves that curses don't work or that you performed the ritual incorrectly, and you've decided not to repeat the experiment. Your daughter once discovered your charm collection and asked innocent questions that you struggle to answer honestly. How do you explain that you carry objects your priest would condemn while also teaching her to respect church authority? How do you justify protecting the family with methods that official theology rejects while insisting she memorize her prayers and attend Mass regularly? You deflected with vague statements about old family traditions and changed the subject quickly. But the conversation reminded you that children notice contradictions adults prefer to ignore. The whole stone surface has become polished from constant handling, your nervous fingers rubbing it smooth during anxious moments when you need tangible comfort. You've developed a habit of touching it whenever you hear about illness in the neighborhood, whenever your children seem unusually quiet or feverish, whenever your husband mentions business problems that might threaten the household's financial stability. The stone doesn't actually do anything in these moments, but the ritual of touching it provides a sense of taking action against forces beyond your control. Medieval women's magic operates primarily defensively rather than offensively. You're not trying to gain power or harm enemies, but simply to protect yourself and your family from the 1,000 invisible threats that permeate daily existence. Plague, childbirth complications, crop failures, house fires, jealous neighbours, demonic possession, fairy kidnappings. The list of potential disasters extends infinitely. And official Christianity offers comfort for the afterlife but limited practical assistance with immediate survival. So you supplement prayers with charms, attend Mass while carrying pagan stones, cross yourself before looking through the hagstone's hole to check for curses. The psychological comfort these objects provide might be their actual function regardless of whether any genuine supernatural power exists. When you touch the rabbit's foot, you feel less helpless against fate's randomness. When you look through the holed stone, you feel you're taking active steps to identify threats rather than passively waiting for disaster. When you sleep near the salt and herb bag, you rest more easily believing something guards your dreams. If the charms accomplish nothing beyond reducing your anxiety and helping you function despite constant uncertainty, perhaps that's sufficient justification for carrying them. You've noticed that charm carrying follows class patterns that nobody discusses openly. Wealthy women display elaborate religious jewellery and hire priests to perform protective blessings, achieving similar psychological comfort through expensive, officially sanctioned means. Poor women rely heavily on folk magic because they can't afford professional religious services and need free protection however they can obtain it. You occupy the middle ground, combining purchased holy relics with homemade charms, attending church regularly while also collecting stones from stream beds, trying to cover all supernatural bases through diversified investment in protective strategies. The bent iron nail has started to rust despite your efforts to keep it dry, orange flakes appearing along its length. You should probably replace it with a fresh nail collected during next year's St. John's Eve, but that requires another midnight expedition to the crossroads, and you're not certain you have the courage to repeat that particular adventure. So the nail remains in your pouch despite its deterioration. Still presumably functional, even if less pristine than when you first acquired it. Do you remember finding that hold stone and feeling absolutely certain it was meant for you? Keep that sense of recognition, but we're moving now to more practical literacy. The tools that let you record thoughts and make lists in a world that's mostly illiterate. You push the charms aside with a slight twinge of guilt and your fingers find something considerably more respectable. A pair of wooden tablets bound together with leather hinges, their inner surfaces coated with dark beeswax that accepts the pointed stylus you keep tucked in a leather loop attached to the frame. This writing tablet represents literacy and learning, capabilities that separate you from the majority of medieval women who navigate life without ever forming a single letter. You open the tablet and examine a wax surface. Currently covered with your cramped handwriting listing tomorrow's market purchases, calculations of how much flour the household needs for the week, and a reminder to ask your neighbour about borrowing her large cooking pot for the upcoming feast day. The wax surface bears the accumulated ghosts of previous writings, faint shadows where you pressed the stylus particularly hard, and the wax hasn't quite smoothed completely flat despite warming and re-smoothing. If you look closely, you can make out fragments of last week's shopping list beneath today's notes. Words and numbers layered like geological strata, documenting the archaeology of your domestic concerns. This palimpsest effect creates a strange visual record of routine life: the bread you bought Tuesday, the expense calculations from last month's accounts, the practice letters you wrote when first learning to form consistent characters. Medieval literacy exists along a spectrum that modern binary thinking about reading and writing doesn't quite capture. You can read fluently enough to work through religious texts and household correspondence, sounding out unfamiliar words with only occasional difficulty. Your writing is considerably less accomplished, the letters are uneven, your spelling creative and inconsistent, your compositions laboured and slow compared to the professional scribes who dash off elegant documents in minutes. This asymmetry is common among people with practical rather than scholarly literacy. Reading is easier to learn and more immediately useful, while writing requires extensive practice and frequent application to maintain competence. The stylus for inscribing the wax is a simple pointed metal rod, one end sharpened for writing and the other end flattened for erasing mistakes by smoothing the wax. You've worn a permanent callus on your middle finger from holding the stylus during long writing sessions, and you've developed a distinctive grip that produces letters slanting slightly to the right. Your handwriting has evolved its own character through years of use. Certain letters you form with flourishes copied from the parish scribe. Other letters you've simplified into barely recognisable abbreviations that save time and effort. Someone trained in formal penmanship would probably find your writing nearly illegible, but it works perfectly well for your purposes. Historians still argue whether medieval women's literacy rates were significantly lower than men's, or whether women simply used literacy differently and left fewer permanent records. Some scholars emphasize that formal education excluded most women and that surviving documents show overwhelming male authorship, suggesting that female literacy was rare and exceptional. Other researchers point to indirect evidence: merchants' wives managing accounts, noblewomen conducting correspondence, nuns producing manuscripts, indicating that women's practical literacy was more common than official records suggest. You scratching notes on your wax tablet represent precisely the kind of everyday female literacy that leaves almost no historical trace, because wax melts and reuses itself, erasing evidence of your competence. The wax tablet serves functions that parchment cannot practically accomplish. Parchment costs enormously. A single sheet might represent several days' wages, making it far too precious for temporary notes and casual calculations. The wax tablet lets you write and erase endlessly, using the same surface for shopping lists one day, expense tracking the next. practice letters when you are trying to improve your handwriting. This reusability makes writing accessible for daily use rather than reserved exclusively for important documents that justify parchment's expense. Your current shopping list demonstrates the practical abbreviated notation you've developed. FL 3 days means flour costing 3 pence. Egg-dos indicates a dozen eggs. BRD represents bread, though you're not entirely certain whether you originally meant bread or board. And the ambiguity doesn't matter because context makes the meaning obvious. This personal shorthand works because you're the only person who needs to read these notes. You're not creating documents for posterity or communications for other readers. The privacy of the wax tablet liberates you from concerns about proper spelling or elegant penmanship. Functionality matters more than form. The tablet has also served as your daughter's introduction to literacy, providing a forgiving surface where she can practice letter formation without wasting precious parchment on her uncertain attempts. You've spent evenings guiding her hand, helping her trace letters into the wax, praising her successes and gently correcting her mistakes. She finds writing frustrating and tedious, just as you did at her age. But you're determined she'll acquire at least basic literacy because the world is changing and women who can read and write have advantages that illiterate women increasingly lack. Medieval education for girls happens informally and inconsistently, nothing like the structured schooling that boys from wealthy families receive. You learned your letters from your mother, who learned from an aunt who had spent time in a convent, who presumably learned from nuns who taught reading as a part of religious instruction. This chain of informal transmission means your literacy has gaps and quirks. You can read religious Latin phonetically without understanding most of it. You spell English words according to rules that seem to change depending on your mood. You've never learned formal grammar and construct sentences based purely on how they sound, rather than any systematic understanding of syntax. The act of writing slows your thinking in ways that feel both frustrating and valuable. When you speak, words flow quickly and you often regret statements made in haste or anger. When you write, even on the forgiving wax surface, you must consciously form each letter, giving yourself time to consider whether you actually mean what you're about to inscribe. This enforced deliberation has improved your household management written lists, prevent forgotten purchases. Documented calculations catch arithmetic errors before they cause financial problems. Notes to yourself create accountability that pure memory doesn't provide. Your wax tablet has witnessed private thoughts you'd never speak aloud or commit to permanent parchment. You've written angry sentences about your husband during arguments, scratching vicious words into the wax before smoothing them away, using the tablet as a safe outlet for feelings that would damage your marriage if voiced directly. You've practiced difficult conversations by writing both sides of a dialogue, trying to anticipate responses and prepare better arguments. You've recorded dreams immediately upon waking, capturing strange narratives before they dissolve into vague impressions. Though you've never quite decided what to do with these dream records beyond occasionally rereading them and wondering what your sleeping mind was trying to communicate, the tablet's portability makes it valuable for capturing thoughts and observations during daily activities, rather than waiting until you return home to record them. You've written notes while sitting in church and supposedly listening to sermons, documenting ideas for household improvements or remembering tasks you'd otherwise forget. You've used the tablet market to calculate whether a vendor's prices are fair, comparing stated costs against your budget and verifying that you're not being cheated. You've even written during social visits when you wanted to appear occupied and avoid unwanted conversations, pretending to update your shopping list while actually just making marks in the wax to discourage interruption. The beeswax coating requires periodic maintenance to remain functional. Eventually, the surface becomes too scratched and uneven to write on smoothly, forcing you to melt the wax gently near the fire and redistribute it evenly across the wooden backing. This renewal process happens every few months, and you've developed a technique that avoids burning the wax or creating air bubbles that make the surface lumpy. The fresh wax smells sweet and clean, and writing on a newly prepared tablet feels like beginning again with a pristine slate that holds no trace of previous failures or mundane concerns. Your literacy has created unexpected social complications along with its practical benefits. Some women in your social circle view your reading and writing abilities with suspicion, as if education might make you proud or discontent with proper female roles. Others seek you out to read letters from distant relatives or help compose responses, treating your skills as a useful resource rather than a threatening aberration. You navigate between these reactions carefully, downplaying your competence in some contexts and offering help in others, trying to make literacy seem ordinary rather than exceptional. The stylus's metal point has worn blunt from months of use, no longer creating the crisp lines it produced when new. You need to file it sharp again, adding this task to the mental list of maintenance jobs that accumulate faster than you can complete them. The dull point still functions adequately for casual notes, but detailed calculations or practice letters require precision that the rounded tip can't provide. So sharpening the stylus joins sharpening your eating knife on tomorrow's list of small repairs that keep your tools functional. Do you remember the first time you successfully wrote your own name without anyone guiding your hand? Hold that moment of accomplishment. We're moving now to darker necessities, the medicines and tinctures you carry for emergencies and everyday pain. You close the wax tablet and your fingers find several small glass vials wrapped carefully in cloth to prevent breakage, each one containing liquid remedies that represent the difference between enduring pain and finding relief in a world where professional physicians charge fees most people can't afford. You unwrap the cloth and examine the vials in dim light. One contains a murky brown tincture of willow bark steeped in wine. Another holds clear poppy extract diluted carefully because the concentrated version could stop breathing as easily as it stops pain. And the third vial contains a mixture you're less proud of, an herbal blend for bringing on delayed monthly courses that walks the dangerous line between medicine and sin. The willow bark tincture is your most frequently used remedy, a reliable pain reliever for headaches, toothaches, joint pain, and the monthly cramping that sometimes leaves you unable to work effectively. You learn to make this preparation from your mother, who learned from her mother, passing down knowledge about which willow species work best and how long to steep the bark in wine to extract maximum benefit without creating a mixture so bitter it's impossible to swallow. The tincture tastes terrible regardless of your preparation technique, astringent and woody, with an underlying bitterness that makes you grimace every time you dose yourself, but it works well enough that you tolerate the flavour. Medieval medicine blends observation, tradition, superstition, and desperate hope into systems that sometimes help and sometimes harm in roughly equal measure. The willow bark genuinely contains compounds that reduce pain and fever, though you don't know the chemistry behind why it works and wouldn't understand explanations involving salicylic acid, even if someone could provide them. You just know that drinking the tincture correlates with pain reduction often enough that the pattern seems real rather than coincidental. Whether it's the willow bark itself or the wine or some combination or pure placebo effect doesn't particularly matter, as long as your headache fades and you can return to necessary work. The poppy extract represents significantly more dangerous territory. You purchased this vial from an apothecary who measured the dose carefully and warned you repeatedly about the risks of taking too much drowsiness, confusion, stopped breathing, death. You've used it exactly 3 times, all during episodes of pain so severe that you couldn't think straight and would have accepted considerable risk for relief. The poppy tincture works brilliantly, transforming agony into distant discomfort and wrapping you in warm indifference to suffering. It also makes you useless for hours afterward, floating in dreamy detachment while your household needs attention and your children need supervision. So the vial remains mostly full, reserved for emergencies when pain overrides concerns about functionality. Historians still argue whether medieval people had effective pain management or whether they simply endured suffering that modern medicine would find unconscionable. Some scholars point to extensive pharmacopoeias listing hundreds of remedies, suggesting that medieval physicians and folk healers possessed genuine knowledge about pain relief. Other researchers emphasize that many supposed remedies were useless or harmful, that surgical procedures happened without adequate anesthesia, and that chronic pain was simply an accepted part of existence that people endured without effective treatment. You carrying poppy extract in your pouch have more options than many medieval people, but you're still closer to enduring pain than controlling it by modern standards. The third vial contains pennyroyal tansy, and rue steeped in strong wine, a mixture with a reputation for bringing on delayed monthly bleeding and solving the problems that arise when bleeding fails to appear on schedule. You've never used this particular vial, though you mixed it 6 months ago when your courses were late and you panicked about another pregnancy your body and household couldn't handle. Your bleeding started naturally before you resorted to the tincture, and you've kept the mixture since then as insurance against future scares. The vial represents autonomy over your reproductive fate, however limited and dangerous that autonomy might be in practice. The Church condemns using herbs to prevent conception or end pregnancies as murder, equivalent to killing a living child, and the law agrees with increasingly harsh penalties for women caught attempting to control their fertility through botanical means. Yet every woman you know understands which herbs supposedly prevent pregnancy, which ones bring on delayed courses, which ones can end early pregnancies if taken in sufficient quantities. This knowledge circulates through whispered conversations and careful demonstrations, passed from experienced women to younger ones facing desperate situations. The gap between official prohibition and actual practice is wide enough to hold thousands of women's secret decisions. Your pouch also contains a tiny jar of honey mixed with crushed garlic, a remedy for infected wounds that you've found surprisingly effective despite its simplicity. When your son scraped his knee badly last month, you cleaned the wound with wine and then applied the honey-garlic paste, covering it with clean linen and changing the dressing daily. The infection that you'd feared would develop never appeared, and the wound healed cleanly in less than 2 weeks. Whether the honey or garlic or both deserves credit. You don't know, you just know the combination seems to work better than either ingredient alone or letting wounds heal without treatment. Medieval hygiene practices around wound care range from surprisingly effective to horrifyingly counterproductive. You've heard that some physicians pack wounds with fresh dung to promote healing, a practice that makes you nauseous to contemplate and that you suspect causes more deaths than it prevents. You've also learned that keeping wounds clean and covered, changing dressings regularly, and watching for signs of infection increasing redness, foul-smelling discharge. Fever produces better outcomes than elaborate interventions. This knowledge comes from observation rather than theory, from noticing which treatments correlate with healing and which ones precede catastrophic infections. The glass vials themselves represent significant investment classes, expensive and fragile, requiring careful protection from the bumps and pressures of daily life in your pouch. You've wrapped each vial in multiple layers of soft cloth, creating padded cocoons that absorb shocks and prevent the vials from clinking against hard objects like your keys or knife. You've still broken 2 vials over the years despite precautions, losing their contents and facing the expense of replacement. The current vials have survived 6 months of daily carrying, making them veterans in the dangerous environment of your travelling pouch. Your medical knowledge exists in an uncomfortable space between competence and ignorance. You know enough to treat common ailments and minor injuries, enough to recognise when someone needs professional help beyond your capabilities, enough to distinguish between remedies that sometimes work and pure superstitious nonsense. But you also lack systematic understanding of anatomy, disease processes, or the mechanisms behind why certain treatments produce certain results. You operate on pattern recognition and inherited wisdom, noticing correlations without understanding causation, achieving practical results through methods you can't fully explain. The remedies you carry mark you as a neighbourhood resource during medical emergencies. Women from surrounding households know you keep pain tinctures and wound treatments, and they sometimes appear at your door asking to borrow a dose of willow bark or requesting help treating an injury. You provide this assistance freely when you can afford it, charging nothing but accepting reciprocal help when you need it. Participating in the informal medical economy that exists parallel to the official world of licensed physicians serving wealthy patients. Your daughter watches your remedy making with intense interest, asking questions about which plants do what and how you know the proper doses. You're teaching her gradually, sharing knowledge that might save her life or her children's lives someday. But you're also careful about what you share, and when some knowledge is dangerous in young hands, and some remedies require judgment that only develops through years of experience and observation. The pennyroyal tincture stays hidden during these lessons, its existence unmentioned until she's older and facing situations where such knowledge becomes necessary rather than merely dangerous. The vials rattle slightly when you walk despite your careful padding, creating a subtle musical sound that marks you as someone carrying liquids. You've become so accustomed to this small noise that you barely notice it. But strangers sometimes look at your pouch curiously when they hear the characteristic tinkle of glass on glass. You've learned to deflect questions with vague references to household necessities or personal items, protecting your privacy while avoiding outright lies that might invite more intrusive questioning. Medieval women's medicine operates largely outside formal regulation, creating space for both genuine healing knowledge and dangerous quackery. You've witnessed both extremes: women whose herbal treatments genuinely help their communities, and charlatans selling useless or harmful preparations to desperate people. You try to fall into the first category, testing remedies carefully, admitting when you don't know something, refusing to promise cures you can't deliver. But you also recognise that the line between healing and harming can be terrifyingly thin, that effective remedies become dangerous poisons at higher doses, that good intentions don't prevent tragic mistakes. Do you remember the first time someone asked for your help treating an injury and your remedy actually worked? Hold that moment of useful competence. We're moving finally to the pouch itself, examining what this little leather bag reveals about medieval women's lives and identities. You rewrap the medicine vials carefully, and for the first time tonight you examine the pouch itself, rather than just its contents. Running your fingers across the leather exterior that has absorbed years of handling, weather, and the accumulated oils from your skin. The leather was once a rich brown. You remember from the day you purchased it at the market fair, but it has darkened and softened into something closer to black. The colour transformed by sweat and rain and the 1,000 small contacts that come from hanging at your hip through countless days. The pouch has become an extension of your body, as familiar as your own hands, worn into perfect conformity with your daily movements and needs. The craftsmanship of the pouch tells its own story about medieval leatherworking and the skilled artisans who transform animal hides into functional objects. Someone, probably a cobbler or specialised leatherworker, cut this pouch from a single piece of cowhide, folded it precisely, and stitched the seams with waxed linen thread that has held firm despite years of stress. The stitching follows a pattern that's both decorative and functional, creating a watertight seal along the bottom and sides while leaving the top open for access. The leatherworker stamped a simple geometric pattern into the front surface. Diamonds within circles that catch light and create visual interest without requiring the expensive tooling or dies that mark truly luxurious bags. The pouch's size represents careful calculation about capacity versus burden. Too small and you can't carry necessary items, forcing you to make multiple trips or leave essential objects at home. Too large and the pouch becomes heavy and cumbersome, swinging awkwardly as you walk and straining the belt or girdle supporting its weight. Your pouch hits the perfect middle ground, large enough to hold everything we've explored tonight, small enough that its weight remains manageable even when fully loaded. This sizing probably reflects centuries of collective experience among medieval women. Knowledge about optimal pouch dimensions passed down through generations and incorporated into craftsmen's standard patterns. The leather strap attaching your pouch to your belt shows the most wear of any component, rubbed thin where it loops through the metal ring and creased from constant folding when you remove the bag to access its contents more easily. You've reinforced this strap twice already with additional leather strips wrapped and stitched around the weakest points, extending the pouch's functional life but creating a lumpy appearance that marks the bag as old and well used rather than new and pristine. You could afford a new pouch if you saved for a few months, but this one still functions adequately, and replacing it seems wasteful when the money could feed your family or purchase winter fuel. Historians still argue whether medieval material culture was more sustainable than modern consumption patterns, or whether people simply lacked the productivity to generate significant waste. Some scholars emphasize that medieval people repaired rather than replaced, used items until they literally disintegrated, and created relatively little trash compared to modern societies. Other researchers note that medieval people would have consumed more if they could afford it, that their sustainability was enforced by poverty rather than chosen for environmental reasons, and that they produced plenty of waste despite lower overall consumption levels. You're repairing your pouch for the third time, aren't making an environmental statement, you're just too poor to buy new leather bags casually. The pouch's exterior has acquired stains and marks that document your daily activities like a visual diary. There's a dark spot where you spilled wine during last autumn's harvest celebration, a pale scratch from catching the bag on a rough stone wall, a small burn mark from holding the pouch too close to a candle while searching for something in dim light. These imperfections would horrify someone concerned with maintaining pristine possessions, but they don't bother you particularly. The marks prove the bag is used and useful, actively participating in your life, rather than sitting decoratively on a shelf. The social semiotics of pouches create complex status hierarchies that everyone can read, but nobody explicitly discusses. A noblewoman's silk purse embroidered with gold thread and hanging from a jewelled chain announces wealth, leisure, and social position far above yours. A peasant woman's rough linen bag tied with hemp cord signals poverty and limited options. Your leather pouch with its simple stamp decoration and functional brass fittings marks you as comfortably middle tier, neither struggling desperately nor living luxuriously, exactly where you want strangers to position you in the medieval social landscape. The pouch is a costume element that helps you perform your assigned role in society's pageant. Medieval sumptuary laws attempt to regulate even pouches and bags, forbidding people below certain social ranks from carrying accessories made from expensive materials or decorated beyond their station. You've heard that in some cities, authorities can fine women caught carrying silk purses when their husband's income doesn't justify such luxury. These laws rarely get enforced consistently. There are too many women and too few inspectors to monitor everyone's accessories, but they create background anxiety about whether your possessions might attract unwanted official attention. Your plain leather pouch stays safely below the threshold that might trigger enforcement. Neither humble enough to suggest poverty, nor fancy enough to imply pretensions above your station. The way you carry your pouch sends subtle signals about your current mood and concerns. When you feel confident and relaxed, you let it swing freely at your hip, its weight a comfortable accompaniment to your movements. When you're anxious or in questionable neighbourhoods, you hold the pouch tight against your body, sometimes clutching it with one hand to prevent theft or loss. When you're angry or frustrated, you unconsciously grip the pouch's strap harder, finding its solidity grounding during emotional turbulence. The pouch has become so integrated into your physical presence that manipulating it provides unconscious emotional regulation, a security object that you'd probably deny needing if anyone asked directly. Your pouch has witnessed everything we've explored tonight and countless moments we haven't documented: the birth of your children, the death of your mother, arguments with your husband, quiet afternoons when nothing remarkable happened but life continued anyway. The leather has absorbed your sweat during illness, gotten soaked during rainstorms when you couldn't find shelter quickly enough, dried stiff in winter cold before softening again near the fire. The pouch is simultaneously an object and a companion, a thing you own and a witness to your existence. The inevitable future replacement of this pouch creates vague sadness that you try not to examine too closely. Eventually the leather will crack beyond repair, the stitching will fail too catastrophically to mend, or the strap will break at a moment when you can't immediately fix it. When that happens, you'll visit the leatherworker's stall at market and purchase a new pouch that will feel strange and stiff, requiring months of use before it softens into comfortable familiarity. You'll transfer all your possessions from the old pouch to the new one: the keys, coins, needles, herbs, devotional tokens, cosmetics, mirror, love tokens, sealing supplies, knife, charms, writing tablet, and medicine vials that we've examined together tonight. The objects will remain constant even as their container transforms, creating continuity across the transition. Some women keep their old pouches even after replacing them, storing the worn bags in chests as mementos of years past. You've seen your mother-in-law's collection of ancient pouches, leather bags so deteriorated they're barely recognizable but preserved anyway, because they represent different eras of her life. The pouch from her wedding year, the one she carried when her children were young, the bag she used during the years she managed her husband's business accounts. You haven't decided yet whether you'll become that kind of woman, saving pouches as memory objects, or whether you'll discard the old bag once it's replaced and avoid the clutter of sentimental preservation. The act of carrying everything important in one small container creates vulnerability that you manage through constant vigilance and practiced habit. You've developed automatic behaviours checking that the pouch is still attached to your belt every few minutes, repositioning it when you sit or stand to prevent it from swinging awkwardly, maintaining awareness of its weight and presence throughout your day. Losing this pouch would be catastrophic, erasing not just the monetary value of its contents, but the accumulated tools and tokens that make your daily life function. You know women who've lost pouches to thieves or carelessness, and you've witnessed the scrambling replacement process that follows buying new keys, replacing coins from limited reserves, mourning the irreplaceable sentimental items gone forever. The pouch rests against your hip now as you stand in the market square where this exploration began, its familiar weight a comfort and a responsibility. Inside this small leather container you carry the infrastructure of medieval womanhood, the keys that grant domestic authority, the coins that permit economic participation, the needles that maintain your family's clothing, the herbs that ward off disease, the religious tokens that protect your soul, the cosmetics that help you meet beauty standards, the mirror that lets you verify your appearance, the love tokens that preserve emotional complexity, the seals that authenticate your communications, the knife that lets you dine with dignity, the charms that guard against supernatural threats, the writing tools that capture your thoughts, the medicines that ease pain and suffering, and the leather container that holds everything together. You adjust the pouch's position, feeling it settle into its accustomed place, and continue with your day. The market awaits. Vegetables need purchasing, children need feeding, and a household requires management. Your pouch accompanies you through all of it, swinging gently with each step, containing the small essentials that medieval women need to navigate a world that alternately empowers and constrains them in ways both obvious and subtle. The contents of this little bag tell the truth about medieval women's lives more honestly than any chronicle or church record. We were managers and believers, vain and practical, sentimental and calculating, superstitious and capable, constrained by law but resourceful within those constraints, carrying our authority and our vulnerabilities together in leather pouches that hung from our belts and accompanied us everywhere we dared to go. The afternoon light softens as you walk home from the market, your pouch slightly heavier now with fresh purchases nestled among the familiar objects. Your fingers brush the leather surface one more time, feeling its warmth, its worn familiarity, its promise that tomorrow you'll fill it again with the same essential items and venture out into the world equipped for whatever challenges medieval life presents. The pouch will be there, holding your keys and coins and secrets, marking you as a woman who carries her own authority despite a world designed to deny it. And that's enough. That's always been enough. The keys jingle softly as you walk. The coins shift and settle. The herbs release their faint fragrance. Everything essential travels with you, contained in leather, carried forward into whatever comes next.